Chapter 1. The Paper in the Hymnal. The first thing Eleanor Finch saw on coming into the music room was not the tree, nor the piano, nor Miss Marple's mild pink face bent over a plate of iced bun. It was a scrap of paper caught in the edge of a hymnal, as neatly as a white feather set in a black hat. It had been folded only once. Somebody had put it there carefully, not tucked it away in haste. The page of the hymnal bulged around it, as though the book itself had developed a thought it was trying not to show. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, still holding her gloves, and had the absurd feeling that she had entered upon a conversation already in progress. The room had that quality old houses sometimes possessed in winter, when the fire was lit but the corners remained cool, warmth in the middle, reserved at the edges. The piano gave off the dry smell of felt and old varnish. There was beeswax from the polished stool, orange peel from a bowl left on the window-sill, and that faint papery scent of hymn books, which always suggested damp stone floors and elderly fingers. "You are Miss Finch, I think," said Miss Marple, looking up. "Your aunt told me to expect you, and I am so glad you have arrived before the light entirely goes out. Country roads are apt to deceive one in December, and one never quite forgets a pony cart from St. Mary Mead that went into a ditch merely because the driver insisted a hedge was a turning." She spoke as if the matter of ditches and pony carts were of gentle importance, and perhaps it was. Eleanor, who had come from London with a valise, a headache, and a determination not to be sentimental about Christmas, found herself smiling in spite of everything. "Yes, I am Eleanor Finch. My aunt has gone to lie down," they said. "She has done the sensible thing. Sensible things are so often undervalued at Christmas, because people become determined to prove affection by overexertion. Your aunt looked quite pale after the luncheon, though she denied it in a very spirited manner. Miss Marple's knitting lay beside her untouched. She had a way of appearing entirely occupied with comfort, while in fact noticing what most people preferred should pass unnoticed. Eleanor had met women of that sort before in hospital waiting rooms and railway compartments, and had always felt a little safer in their company. She put down her gloves and moved toward the piano. The scrap of paper remained where it was, half visible between the pages of carols ancient and modern. "Oh," said Eleanor, touching the book with one finger. "Someone has left something." Miss Marple's eyes lifted to it only for a second. "So they have. One always thinks in a house full of guests that the lost object will be gloves or spectacles. In reality, it is more often a thought written down and put where it should not be." It was such an odd remark that Eleanor looked at her properly then. Miss Marple was arranging currants on her plate into a small crescent with the end of a teaspoon. Nothing in her face suggested emphasis, yet the sentence remained in the room. Before Eleanor could answer, the door opened, and her aunt's husband, the Reverend Julian Finch, came in with a burst of colder air and the sound of voices from the passage. "My dear Eleanor, at last." He crossed to kiss her cheek. "We had almost begun to fear the train had deposited you in some theological wilderness, from which return was impossible. You have met Miss Marple, I see. Then you are in the best hands. She has already rescued our mince pies from spiritual and material collapse." "I merely suggested a lower shelf," said Miss Marple. "Zeal is admirable, but pastry seldom benefits from it." Julian laughed with real pleasure. He was a narrow, energetic man in his early 50s, with kind eyes made perpetually anxious by parish life and by marriage, to a woman whose health had become uncertain in ways no doctor could fully mend. Eleanor was fond of him. She thought him good rather than clever, which in a clergyman might be either a blessing or a difficulty. "Arthur is in the chapel," he said, glancing toward the covered passage. "He insists upon one more rehearsal before supper, though I told him the choir boys are half frozen and the altos already mutinous. Clara has gone to fetch hot water bottles as if preparing for a siege, and we have 3 more guests not yet down." "Mr. Bellamy likes exact things," said Eleanor. "My dear girl, he likes them obedient." "Exactness is only the public word for it." Julian said it lightly, but there was a small roughness under the tone. Eleanor noticed, because she always noticed tones. It was a trick that had never made her happy, though it had made her useful in offices, and during the war, more useful than she had wished to be. "Is he still as formidable as ever?" she asked. Julian widened his eyes theatrically. "He corrected my breathing during the Magnificat yesterday. I am 52 years old, and theoretically master of this house. And yet Arthur Bellamy can still make me feel like a chorister with dirty cuffs." Miss Marple gave a soft little sound that might have been amusement. There was a gentleman in St. Mary Mead, Mr. Pritchard, the ironmonger's brother, who always arranged village concerts and considered himself indispensable because he had a tuning fork and strong views. He was very much respected until the evening he lost his temper with the curate over "Abide with Me," and accidentally revealed that what he cared for was not the hymn at all, but the sensation of 37 people obeying him at once. It is very odd how often authority dresses itself as devotion. Julian laughed again, though Eleanor saw him colour slightly. The observation had gone near enough to truth to touch more than one person in the house, and Miss Marple, having said it, reached placidly for a bun, as though she had merely commented on jam. The voices in the passage drew nearer. Then they entered together. Arthur Bellamy first, carrying music in a hard leather case under his arm, and behind him Clara Hastings with a basket of folded wraps. Bellamy was tall, though he stooped now from the shoulders, and his white hair was brushed back so exactly that it seemed less a natural arrangement than a principle. His cheeks were bloodless from the cold. He looked like one of those men who had spent years teaching others how to stand properly and sing from the diaphragm, and had never once considered whether they wished to. "My dear Reverend," he began, before he had fully crossed the threshold, "if the tenors continue to swallow their consonants in that manner, the congregation may as well be addressed by sheep." Then he saw Eleanor, and altered at once, becoming courtly. "Miss Finch, we are honoured. Your mother had a clear soprano, if I remember rightly, though inclined to sentiment in the upper register. One hopes such things do not descend inevitably." "My singing would displease you in a wholly new way," said Eleanor. That seemed to amuse him. It gave his face an animation without warmth. He bowed over her hand more than was necessary, and set down his music case on the piano. Clara Hastings, who had followed him in, gave Eleanor a nod and a smile that might have been called sisterly, had there not been something measured in it. She was a handsome woman, perhaps in her early 40s, dressed with the practical neatness of someone who spent her life among thermometers, medicine bottles, frightened children, and old people who preferred not to be fussed over. She had dark hair parted cleanly in the middle, and a voice that rested easily in the ear. Many people liked her at once for sounding sensible. "You must be tired after the journey," Clara said. "I have put a warming pan in your bed and sent up more coal. Your aunt was anxious that the blue room might feel draughty, but I think we have managed it. Thank you. That is kind. It is only common management. Houses of this age require tending as elderly ladies do, quietly and without contradiction." "Speak for yourself, dear Clara," said Miss Marple with a smile. "Many elderly ladies are greatly improved by contradiction, though seldom at the moment it is offered." Bellamy was already at the hymnal. Eleanor saw his hand move toward the volume containing the folded paper. Then, for one fraction of a second, he paused. It was not the pause of a man who had found what he expected. It was the stillness of someone recognizing an unwelcome thing in company. He slipped the paper farther in, shut the book, and laid another on top of it. The action was so smooth that Julian noticed nothing. Clara was setting down her basket. Miss Marple appeared occupied in brushing sugar from her cuff. Yet Eleanor, standing only 2 feet away, saw Bellamy's fingers tighten before they released the book. A small incident. Hardly that. Less than a sentence in the language of a day. But it altered the room for her. "You have changed the order for tonight's carols, I hope," Bellamy said to Julian. "The second verse of 'While Shepherds Watched' must be omitted if we are to keep the service from sprawling. People become charitable about worship only when it ends in time for supper." Julian said mildly, "In a village, Arthur, people become charitable when allowed to sing the verses they know. They know them badly. They know them with affection." Bellamy removed his gloves finger by finger. Affection is the ruin of standards. That, Eleanor thought, was the sort of remark by which a whole life might be summarized. Miss Marple was watching the fire. "And yet standards without affection are apt to make one lonely," she said. "I remember poor Mrs. Elwell in St. Mary Mead, who produced the most exact seed cake in 3 counties, and could not understand why no one stayed for a second slice. It turned out she had spent 20 years correcting her guests, while they chewed. There are many virtues, but few of them are improved by too much supervision." Bellamy smiled in the direction of the mantelpiece, which was not the same as smiling at a person. "I have always observed, Miss Marple, that village wisdom is most appealing when it remains in villages." "My dear Mr. Bellamy," she said, "that is because the things people conceal in the country are so very similar to the things they conceal in towns. Only the wallpaper differs." Clara bent to lift the basket again. The movement was ordinary enough, but Eleanor noticed that she had turned her face away. Not far, only enough that one could not see her expression for a moment. Then the gong sounded for dressing. The room broke apart into motion. Julian remembered a message for his wife and hurried off. Clara said she must check on the Travers boy's cough before changing. Bellamy took up his leather case, and, after the briefest glance at the piano, left by the chapel passage. Miss Marple remained in her chair until they had all gone, as though old ladies possessed an exemption from the ordinary tides of household activity. Eleanor picked up her gloves again. "I thought Mr. Bellamy looked troubled." Miss Marple adjusted the wool in her lap. "Did you indeed? That is interesting. He found something in that book." "Yes." "You saw it too?" "My dear, when one reaches my age, one need not see everything. One has only to observe what other people wish had not been seen." Eleanor hesitated. "Do you think it matters?" Miss Marple looked toward the piano. The closed hymnals sat there in a sober black stack, the upper one very slightly crooked. "In my experience," she said, "anything placed inside a carol book in the week before Christmas matters to somebody a great deal. The difficulty is that one does not yet know whether it signifies folly, unhappiness, or wickedness, and those three, you know, are forever being mistaken for one another." She rose then with the slow care of someone whose bones must be persuaded, but whose mind needed no such assistance. At the door she paused and touched Eleanor's sleeve lightly. "There is one thing I would suggest," she said. "Do not mention the paper, not tonight. People tell one far more when they think a secret remains comfortably hidden." Then she smiled with such gentleness that the advice might have been about preserving meringues from damp, and went out into the darkening passage. Eleanor was left alone in the music room. The light had thinned to a blue-violet wash at the windows. Beyond the glass, the orchard rails stood black over the pale ground, and one last thrush hopped beneath the bare espalier pear trees as though searching for something dropped and lost. From the chapel came a faint scatter of notes. Not music now, only someone trying intervals on the organ and failing to trust them. The house itself answered with tiny sounds of winter settlement, a board shrinking near the skirting, a pipe tapping in the wall. Eleanor moved to the piano. She did not touch the books. She only looked. The top hymnal had shifted enough to reveal the one beneath, and from its pages projected the merest edge of white, thought written down and put where it should not be. She stood very still, hearing in memory Bellamy's controlled voice. Clara Hastings even won, Julian's strained cheerfulness, and Miss Marple's soft remark about authority dressing itself as devotion. It seemed to Eleanor then that Christmas in the vicarage had already begun to arrange itself into separate melody, each harmless alone, each perhaps misleading, and that somewhere among them a wrong note had been struck so quietly that only one or two people had noticed. From the passage outside came footsteps returning. Eleanor turned from the piano just before the latch moved. Chapter 2. What the Chapel Kept. The door opened, and Mrs. Dallow, who had been with Eleanor's aunt for the better part of 10 years, put in her head with the cautious expression of one entering a room where she suspected either private tears or missing silver. "Oh, there you are, miss. I was told to say your hot water has been refreshed, though I dare say it has gone halfway cold again in the carrying. These passages do hold the chill, and that covered weight of the chapel is worse than any of it. It gives me a feeling in the back of the neck that I do not care for, especially after dark." She came in farther as she spoke, and began straightening objects that did not, to Eleanor's eye, require straightening. Mrs. Dallow belonged to that tribe of women who could not convey information unless their hands were occupied in mild correction of the world. She moved a chair half an inch, folded a napkin that had already been folded, took up the orange bowl and set it down again. "It is a handsome room," Eleanor said. "It was handsome before Mr. Bellamy took to moving things about for acoustics. That screen used to stand by the door, and the fern was by the window, until he said it swallowed sound, though I could not see it myself. A fern being expected to mind music does seem a great deal to ask. Still, gentlemen with musical ears are like gentlemen with digestion. One hears more than one wishes." Eleanor smiled. "You don't care for Mr. Bellamy?" Mrs. Dallow gave kind of sniff that declared itself above opinion, while expressing one very thoroughly. "I care for people who thank you when you carry in their coal scuttle, and do not tell you your tread on the stairs is rhythmically unfortunate. There are some that make pleasure sound like criticism, and some that make criticism sound like education. He belongs to the second sort. You'll excuse me for saying so, miss, but there it is. She lowered her voice and came closer, though there was no one to overhear. He has had the village tied in little knots for years. Choir mothers, church ladies, girls bringing greenery, everybody wanting to please him and coming away smaller than they went in. That is a way with some. They don't shout, they are. One bit at a time. It was a good word. Pair. Eleanor thought at once of Bellamy's hand closing the... Has he always stayed here at Christmas? Since his sister died, near enough. Your uncle says charity, and perhaps it is. Mr. Bellamy had nowhere agreeable to go after that, and I will say this for him, he likes the service proper, not cheerful exactly, proper. He would rather have 6 unhappy voices in tune than 20 joyful ones wandering. Though between ourselves, miss, a joyful wander has more Christian feeling in it than he ever managed. She caught herself, perhaps remembering the nature of the household, and added in a hurry, not that I would presume on church matters. No, said Eleanor. Of course not. Mrs. Dallow gave the piano a suspicious look, and I do not like papers left in books. It leads to trouble. Eleanor kept her face still. Does it? It always has in my experience. Recipes in cookbooks, money in Bibles, notes in drawers. Paper does not stay where it belongs because people do not. That is the root of it. The statement, though sweeping, was delivered with such conviction that Eleanor might have laughed had there not been something in it. Before she could answer, voices sounded again in the passage, and Mrs. Dallow withdrew with brisk dignity, as if she had said nothing at all improper. Eleanor went upstairs to dress. The blue room overlooked the orchard. It was one of those bedrooms that had been pretty for so many decades that prettiness had settled into fatigue, faded chintz, a dressing table with one leg slightly shorter than the others, a rug patterned with roses worn to ghosts beneath the washstand. Yet there was comfort in it too. Somebody had laid lavender among the linen. The warming pan had left a dry heat beneath the sheets. Her aunt's care showed in particular rather than display. As Eleanor unpinned her hat, she found herself listening. Old houses altered their sounds according to the hour. Before tea, they muttered. At bedtime, they sighed. In the interval before dinner, when people bathed, dressed, searched drawers, called for brushes, and crossed landings in heeled shoes, a house seemed to gather its forces. Netherwitchwood Vicarage was doing so now. Somewhere a tap ran, a door shut softly, another shut with emphasis. From below came a drift of piano notes, struck without melody, as if someone were testing the instrument's truthfulness. She stood at the window in her petticoat and watched the orchard fade. The iron railings divided the whitened ground into strict dark bars. Beyond them the village roofs crouched low under evening, and the small chapel roof attached to the house by its covered passage rose like the shoulder of an older thought. A lamp had been lit at the chapel door. Its narrow glow made the frosted panes shine dully. There was movement there. A figure came along the passage from the house, carrying a candle shaded with one hand. The light showed Clara Hastings for a moment, plain and strong in outline, the basket of hot water bottles now gone. She stopped halfway, set the candle on the ledge beneath the window, and looked down at something she held. A paper. Even at that distance, Eleanor knew it was paper, because Clara lifted it closer to the flame, and then bent her head with the quick, intent stillness of reading. She was only there a moment. Then she folded the thing, slipped it into the front of her dress, and went on into the chapel. Eleanor remained by the window long after she had disappeared. It might mean nothing. Houses full of guests and church preparations naturally produced lists, notes, arrangements, reminders. Yet Clara had not read it with the air of a woman checking the order of holly or the count of pudding plates. She had read it as Bellamy had first looked at it, with a flash of recognition and dislike. By the time Eleanor came down, the drawing-room had filled. Her aunt, Margaret Finch, was on the sofa near the fire, a shawl over her shoulders and colour in her cheeks that seemed painted there by will alone. Illness had thinned her without making her gentle. She had always been affectionate and rather imperious, and the combination remained. Beside her stood Dr. Haydock from the neighbouring village, invited to dinner less because he was amusing than because at Christmas one liked a doctor at hand if one had a wife who tired too quickly. Near the mantelpiece, a young curate named Peter Lorimer was trying to make conversation with an elderly cousin of Julian's, who believed all modern hymns sentimental and most modern clergy insufficiently wet in the soul. Miss Marple sat with folded hands listening to them all, in the way a cat may appear to sleep while keeping account of a room. Bellamy arrived last, dressed with severe elegance. Clara followed a minute later in dark green silk, which made her look almost festive, though she wore it or wore everything, without invitation to remark. She spoke at once to Margaret about the evening medicines, and Margaret answered with a fleeting impatience. "You all treat me as if I were a cracked teacup. I have survived 3 winters, 2 incompetent specialists, and a parish bazaar. I shall certainly survive supper." "My dear," said Julian, "the bazaar very nearly killed us all." That produced the expected laugh. Only Bellamy did not join it. He had taken up a glass of sherry, and was examining the room over the rim with an expression Eleanor had seen before in committee men and schoolmasters, the look of one measuring failure in advance. They went in to dinner. The dining room was long and rather too dark, panelled in old church oak, rescued, Julian always said, from a chapel restoration that had favoured ugliness over history. Candlelight deepened the grain until the walls seemed to drink it. Holly had been set between the silver candlesticks, and there was a bowl of forced narcissus near Margaret's place, giving off that sharp green sweetness which belongs less to flowers than to the idea of them being pelled too early. Conversation moved unevenly at first. Dr. Haydock related some village absurdity involving a turkey in the blacksmith's yard. Margaret scolded Julian for carving too much for everybody. The elderly cousin, Mrs. Verney, attacked the gravy as though correcting it morally. Peter Lorimer, whose face had the open, worried honesty of a man who expected to fail people, and often did, tried 3 separate subjects before finding one that did not collapse. It was Bellamy who steadied the table, though not comfortably. He spoke of the carol service, of village standards, of what Christmas had become in the hands of those who confused reverence with noise. He spoke well. That was the difficulty with certain exacting people. They made sense locally while damaging life generally. The old descendants are beyond them now, he said, not because they are difficult, but because everyone has been encouraged to believe effort is oppressive. A tradition is like embroidery. Pull one practical thread, and soon you are holding only whole. Julian buttered bread for Margaret before answering. A tradition may also be like embroidery, in that it survives small clumsy hands rather better than its guardians suppose. Bellamy smiled. That is a clergyman's optimism. It is a pastor's necessity. Miss Marple, who had been eating very little and observing a great deal, said softly, "There was once in Sant Mary Mead a lady called Miss Hartnell, who preserved her drawing-room so perfectly that after 40 years it still looked prepared for guests who had never enjoyed themselves there. She called that victory over decay. Most of us called it loneliness with antimacassars. One does wonder sometimes whether preserving a thing and loving it are exactly the same." Margaret looked amused. Peter Lorimer blushed as if he had been personally examined. Clara kept her eyes on the vegetables she was serving, but Eleanor saw the faint stiffening of her wrist. Bellamy turned to Miss Marple with a civility that had edges. "You favour the untidy school of devotion, then?" "Oh no, I am very fond of order. Only one likes to know what it is for." The sentence might have dropped lightly anywhere else. Here it seemed to strike and remain. A little later the matter arose almost by accident. Julian mentioned that they must settle the final order of the service after dinner, because the hymn numbers had evidently been changed again. "Changed?" Bellamy set down his fork. "By whom?" "That is what I hoped you would tell her. The list in the vestry is not the list I approve." "I altered nothing after Tuesday," Peter Lorimer said. "I thought perhaps Miss Hastings had done it when she was helping with the papers." Clara looked up at once, not startled exactly, but with a distinct brightness in the eyes. "I moved the stack because it was near the dripping umbrella stand." "I altered nothing." Bellamy's voice became smoother, which made it more unpleasant. "Then somebody has exercised initiative beyond his talents," Julian said. "It may be nothing more than confusion." "Confusion," said Bellamy, "is only another name for people touching what they do not understand." There followed one of those tiny table silences not made by lack of sound, but by too much understanding. Margaret reached for her water glass and did not drink. Peter bent over his plate with the meekness of the perpetually blamed. Dr. Haydock studied the salt, as though considering its medical uses. Clara served the potatoes with perfect steadiness. Eleanor found herself speaking before she meant to. Would it matter so very much if a verse or two changed? Bellamy turned to her, and for the first time there was open irritation in him. "My dear Miss Finch," People who ask that question generally ask it only when they have not done the work. It is always easy to disturb what others have built, Julian said quickly. Arthur. But Miss Marple laid down her fork. One must not be too severe, she said, in that mild, almost apologetic voice of hers. A changed verse may matter a great deal. I have known an entire engagement broken in St. Mary Mead because a gentleman sang one line of a harvest hymn with such confidence and such complete inaccuracy that his intended bride perceived, all at once, that he would be equally certain and equally wrong in domestic matters. She married the baker instead, and was on the whole much happier, though inclined to stoutness. Even Bellamy was obliged to smile at that, if only because not smiling would have made him ridiculous. The table relaxed. Yet Eleanor, looking down the candlelit length of it, had the distinct sense that something had tightened beneath the laughter rather than eased. Later, as the women rose, Clara paused at Bellamy's chair. "I should like a word with you after dinner, Mr. Bellamy," she said pleasantly. "It concerns the service sheets, and I would rather not make a muddle of it before the boys." "Then do not make one," he replied. Her expression did not alter. "That is precisely what I hope to avoid." He inclined his head with chilly assent. Miss Marple, rising slowly beside Eleanor, gave the faintest glance from one to the other. There was nothing dramatic in it, only attention. Yet Eleanor thought with a small unease of the paper in the hymnal and the paper Clara had read in the passage window. There were now too many pieces of paper in the evening for comfort. As the ladies passed out into the hall, the chapel clock, which was always 5 minutes slow and stubborn about correction, began to strike 8 with a rusty, thoughtful sound. Miss Marple touched Eleanor's arm. "Do you know," she murmured, "whenever people say they wish to avoid a muddle, I begin to expect one." And, in the hall beyond, where coats hung and candlelight touched the black tiles, Clara Hastings had already vanished toward the chapel. Chapter 3, the verse. No. One sang coffee was taken in the smaller sitting room, rather than the drawing room, which Margaret declared too formal for after-dinner talk, and too far from the warmth of the kitchen passage to be comfortable. The smaller room had low ceilings, a sag in the middle of the carpet, and the particular smell of books that had been read more often than dusted. Someone had placed a plate of crystallized fruit near the hearth, and the sugar gave off a faint scent that mingled curiously with the polish on the wood. Eleanor took a chair by the window, though there was nothing to be seen now beyond her own reflection and the pale ghost of the room behind her. She watched people instead. It was a habit she did not always admire in herself, but it had served her often enough that she no longer pretended to do without it. Julian had gone back to the dining room with Bellamy and Peter Lorimer, ostensibly to discuss the service sheets. Dr. Haydock had accepted a second glass of port and installed himself near Margaret, with the air of a man who meant to keep an eye on her without appearing to do so. Mrs. Verney had begun a detailed account of a parish scandal 30 years old, which required apparently several maps and a number of emphatic corrections to her own memory. Clara was not there. "She has gone to fetch something," Margaret said when Eleanor asked. "She is forever fetching things. I sometimes suspect she invents deficiencies, so that she may correct them." "That is unkind," said Dr. Haydock mildly. "Miss Hastings keeps your household together with admirable efficiency. If she were to stop fetching things, I would be called upon to do it, and no one would thank her for that." Margaret smiled at him with a quick flash of affection. "You see, Eleanor, how I am managed. Even my unkindnesses are arranged for me." Miss Marple was stirring her coffee, though it had been stirred already. "Management is a curious word," she said. "In St. Mary Mead we once had a lady, Mrs. Crockett, who managed her husband so delicately that he believed himself master of every decision, while in fact he never chose the colour of a tie without her having first declared a preference for something else. It worked beautifully until he discovered it, at which point he made a dreadful fuss and insisted on buying mauve cravats. One cannot manage people indefinitely without resenting it, though one may sometimes manage their resentment as well. Eleanor thought of Bellamy, and wondered, not for the first time, whether he believed himself master or instrument. The door opened, and Clara came in, carrying a small stack of folded papers. She crossed at once to Margaret and laid them beside her. "The corrected service sheets," she said. "I thought it best to have them ready for the boys in the morning." Margaret lifted one and peered at it. "You have a neat hand, Clara. I always envy that nurse. Doctors may scribble, but nurses must write so that people may live by it." Clara smiled faintly. "It is mostly a matter of practice. One writes the same words often enough, and they arrange themselves." Miss Marple looked up. That is very true. Familiar words can become almost invisible to the person who writes them. It is the unusual ones that draw the eye. Clara's fingers paused for the briefest moment on the edge of the papers. I have found the opposite in my work, she said. It is the ordinary things one overlooks. A small change in appetite, a slight difference in breathing, those are what matter. The unusual announces itself. Eleanor thought of the scrap in the hymnal, of Bellamy's hand, of Clara in the passage reading by candlelight. Neither had announced itself. Both had been hidden in the ordinary. Julian came in then, alone. He shut the door behind him with more force than was necessary, and stood for a second, as if he had forgotten why he had come. Then he crossed to Margaret and bent to kiss her. Arthur has gone back to the chapel, he said. He wishes to try the organ once more. And Mr. Lorimer? Asked Miss Marple. Peter has gone to fetch the choir boys' lanterns. They are to be sent home by the back path, and he is determined not to lose any of them in the orchard as he did last year. That was not my fault, came Peter's voice from the passage, and he entered at once, flushed and earnest. The Travers boy insisted on going the long way, and I could hardly drag him by the ear in front of his companions. You might have tried, said Margaret. It would have improved your authority. Peter laughed, though it was a laugh that admitted the truth of what she said. I am not sure my authority survives even the suggestion of ears. Clara had moved to the side table and was pouring coffee. Eleanor noticed that she did not look at Julian as she passed him the cup. He took it without meeting her eyes. It was a small omission, yet it seemed to Eleanor that the room had developed a second conversation beneath the first. One carried on in glances, voided words and gestures made too careful. Miss Marple accepted her coffee and sat back. You are very fortunate in your chapel, she said. It is not every house that possesses a place where people may go when they wish to think of themselves alone. Julian gave a short laugh. Alone is not always what they are, I'm afraid. There is generally a boy or two lurking, or Arthur at the organ, or Clara arranging something with a thoroughness that discourages reflection. I dare say, said Miss Marple, that reflection does not require complete solitude. It requires only that one believe oneself unobserved. Eleanor felt again that faint, uncomfortable admiration for Miss Marple's way of placing a thought and leaving. Shall we go and hear the end of this rehearsal? Margaret said suddenly. If Arthur is to tyrannize, I would like to see it done properly. Besides, the chapel is warmer than this room once the lamps are lit. Dr. Haydock rose at once. If you go, I go. I have no intention of leaving you to climb steps in dim light without supervision. You will supervise me into the grave if you are not careful, Margaret said, but she allowed him to take her arm. They went out together, a small procession through the passage that led to the covered way. The air changed as they entered it. The warmth of the sitting room fell away at once, replaced by a thin, stone-cooled chill that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The window panes along the passage rattled faintly, as Mrs. Dallow had warned, and the candle flames bent as they passed. Eleanor walked beside Miss Marple. It is colder here, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Stone remembers winter more faithfully than people do. It keeps a little of it even when the rest of us have moved on. At the end of the passage, the chapel door stood open. Light spilled out across the flagged floor, and with it came the sound of the organ. Not the scattered notes Eleanor had heard earlier, but a steady line of melody, firm and unyielding. Bellamy sat at the instrument, his back straight, his hands precise. The choir boys stood in 2 rows before him, caps in hand, their breath faintly visible in the air. Peter Lorimer hovered near them, attempting encouragement without interference, which was not his natural talent. Clara stood to one side, near the lectern, the service sheets in her hands. She was watching Bellamy, not the boys. They entered quietly and took places along the back. The organ stopped. Again, said Bellamy, from the second verse. Attend to the consonants. They are not ornaments. They are the structure, the boys began, while shepherds watched their flocks by night. Their voices were uneven but willing. One boy sang too loudly, another too softly. A third came in half a beat late, and blushed as if the sound itself had betrayed him. Bellamy lifted a hand. No. You swallow that in watched, as if it were distasteful to you. It is not distasteful, it is necessary. Again, they began once more. Eleanor found her attention drifting, not to the music, but to the papers in Clara's hands. She held them a little apart from her body, as if aware of them. At one point she glanced down, not to follow the words, but to check something. A particular line, perhaps, or a sequence. Miss Marple leaned slightly toward Eleanor. Do you sing, my dear? She asked in a whisper that carried surprisingly well. Not well enough to be corrected, Eleanor murmured back. That is often the safest level. said Miss Marple. "I have observed that those who sing moderately are left in peace, while those who sing as excellently or badly are subject to improvement." Eleanor smiled faintly. "And Mr. Bellamy improves everything." "Oh yes, some people feel quite lost if they are not improving something. It gives them a sense of purpose, though I once knew a gentleman in St. Mary Mead who improved his garden so thoroughly that nothing grew in it any longer. He called it discipline. The roses called it something else, I imagine." The boys reached the end of the verse. Bellamy nodded, not approvingly, but less disapprovingly than before. "We shall omit the third verse," he said. "It drags." Clara spoke then. "I have left it in the sheets," she said. "It seemed unwise to alter the number again." Bellamy turned on the bench to look at her. "I gave instructions, and I followed them as far as was possible without confusion," she replied. "If you wish to omit it, you may indicate so during the service. That is precisely what I wish to avoid." "Then perhaps the alteration should have been made earlier," she said, still in that even tone. There was a moment in which the air seemed to draw tighter. Julian stepped forward quickly. "We shall manage it between us. A gesture, perhaps, or a slight pause. The congregation will not notice." "The congregation notices everything," said Bellamy. "They notice when one stumbles and when one hesitates. They notice when one lacks conviction. And they notice kindness," said Miss Marple gently from the back, "though not always at once." Bellamy's mouth tightened, but he said nothing more. He turned back to the organ. "Very well. We shall proceed as printed." The boys shifted, relieved. The organ began again. This time Eleanor listened. The first verse passed without incident. The second was steadier. Then came the third, the one Bellamy had wished to omit. There was something in it, not in the words themselves, which were familiar enough, but in the way they were set. A slight irregularity in the phrasing, a pause where there should have been none. A joining of two lines that did not quite belong together. It was subtle. One might hear it and think only that the boys had faltered. But Clara did not look at the boys. She looked at Bellamy, and Bellamy for the first time made a mistake. His hand slipped on the keys. Only slightly, only enough that a chord sounded thinner than it should have. But for a man like him, it was as loud as a dropped plate. He recovered at once. The music continued. The boys sang on, unaware. Yet Eleanor saw the colour drain from his face. When the verse ended, he stopped them. "That will do," he said. It was not a dismissal. It was a retreat. The boys shuffled out, grateful. Peter followed them, murmuring encouragement. Julian lingered, uncertain. Clara remained where she was. Miss Marple touched Eleanor's sleeve. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. "Hear what?" "The thing that is not music." Eleanor looked toward the lectern, toward the papers in Clara's hands, toward Bellamy at the organ, sitting very still. "I think," she said slowly, "that I begin to." Miss Marple nodded, her expression as mild as ever. "Then we must be very patient," she said, "because when something is hidden in a familiar thing, it is seldom the hiding that is clever. It is the familiarity." At the front of the chapel, Bellamy closed the organ lid with a soft, decisive sound, and Clara Hastings folded the service sheets with unusual care. Chapter 4. A very careful arrangement. The chapel emptied in the untidy way. Such places always did once authority withdrew. Boys slipped out in clusters, relieved of attention. Peter Lorimer attempted to shepherd them, and succeeded only in being surrounded by questions about lanterns, boots, and whether singing loudly made one warmer. Julian lingered in the aisle, gathering hymn books into a stack that grew uneven as soon as he turned his back on it. Eleanor remained near the rear pew, not wishing to intrude upon what had just occurred, and yet unwilling to leave it unobserved. There was, she felt, something in the air not yet settled, as though the chapel itself retained the echo of a discord no one had acknowledged aloud. Clara had moved to the small table beside the lectern. The service sheets lay before her in precise order, each folded once along the same line. She did not look at them now. Instead, she stood with one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, her gaze directed toward the organ where Bellamy still sat. He had not risen. That fact, more than anything, altered Eleanor's sense of the moment. Arthur Bellamy, who directed every movement of others with such assurance, who corrected breath and consonant and posture, now remained seated as if the act of standing required a decision he had not yet reached. Julian approached him at last. "My dear Arthur," he said, with a brightness that attempted ease, "the boys have gone, and I think we have done what can be done tonight. Tomorrow will carry us the rest of the way." Bellamy did not turn immediately. When he did, it was with the slight delay of a man who has been thinking something he does not wish to share. "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow." Julian shifted his weight. "About the third verse." "We shall keep it," Bellamy interrupted, since it appears to have acquired an advocate. The words were smooth. The tone was not. Julian glanced, almost involuntarily, toward Clara. It seemed simpler, he said, and I do not think the congregation will mind. Bellamy rose then, and for a moment Eleanor saw the full height of him against the organ, straight and severe, as if he had been cut from the same wood as the instrument. The congregation minds nothing, he said. That is its principal failing. Clara spoke before Julian could answer. The congregation minds what is given to it, she said. If something is altered without explanation, they will feel it even if they cannot name it. If it is presented as it has always been, they will accept it even if it has not. There was no challenge in her voice. It was a statement plain and almost instructional, yet it held. Bellamy looked at her with a kind of stillness Eleanor had not seen before. It was not irritating now. It was attention sharpened to a point. "You speak as if you had experience of such things," he said. "I have experience with people," Clara replied. "They are not so very different in church from what they are elsewhere." Miss Marple, who had come forward with Eleanor, and now stood just within the circle of light, gave a small, agreeable murmur. "That is quite true," she said. "People carry themselves about with them wherever they go. It saves trouble, though it does make disguise more difficult." Bellamy inclined his head slightly, as one acknowledging a remark without granting it weight. "I am not concerned with disguise," he said, "only with correctness." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "That is sometimes more revealing." Julian laughed, but it was a laugh that did not settle. "We shall be quite correct tomorrow, Arthur, I am sure of it. And if we are not, we shall be forgiven. It is Christmas, after all." Bellamy's expression altered again, not softened precisely, but shifted. "Forgiveness is not a substitute for effort," he said. "No," said Julian. "But it is occasionally a substitute for perfection." The exchange might have continued, but Peter Lorimer reappeared at the door, breathless and flushed from the cold. "I have seen the last of them off," he announced, "though the Travers boy insists he saw something in the orchard, and I suspect he will dream of it and attribute it to spiritual influence." "What did he see?" Eleanor asked. "A shape," Peter said, "which in that light could be anything from a bush to a bishop. I advised him to assume it was a bush. It seemed the safer theology." Miss Marple smiled. "Very sensible. In St. Mary Mead we had a child who insisted there was a ghost in the vicarage garden, because he saw a white figure moving among the gooseberry bushes. It turned out to be Mrs. Jenkins hanging sheets at an hour she considered private. The ghost was most indignant at being identified. There was a ripple of laughter. Even Clara's mouth softened. "Then we shall assume Netherwitchwood's spirits are similarly occupied," Julian said. "Come, let us go in. Margaret will think we have founded a new denomination if we remain out here any longer." They moved toward the passage. Bellamy lingered only a moment before following, though Eleanor noticed that as he passed the Lecompton his hand hovered just briefly over the stack of service sheets. He did not touch them. Clara gathered them up instead. The covered passage felt colder now that the chapel lamps were behind them. The candle flames bent more sharply, and the glass panes rattled with a faint, irregular tapping that suggested something loose in the frame. Eleanor walked beside Miss Marple again. "There was something in that verse," she said quietly. "Not the words, but the way it was set." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "There was a small alteration, very small, but one notices such things if one has spent a lifetime observing what people repeat without thinking. Do you think it was done deliberately?" "My dear, almost everything is done deliberately by somebody. The question is only whether that somebody is the person we first suppose." Eleanor considered this. "Mr. Bellamy did not expect it." "No, and Miss Hastings did." Miss Marple gave a little tilt of the head. She expected something. They had reached the end of the passage. The warmth of the house met them again, carrying with it the faint smell of coffee and the more comforting one of bread. In the hall Clara paused. "I must put these in the study," she said, lifting the papers slightly. "If they are left out, they will be altered again, and I should prefer not to write them a third time." Julian nodded. "Of course. Thank you, Clara. You are a model of efficiency." She smiled at him, a polite, untroubled smile, and went toward the study door. Bellamy watched her go. It was not a long look. It did not draw attention. Yet Eleanor, standing just within sight, felt its weight. It was the look of a man who has seen something he cannot immediately interpret, and does not like the possibilities. Miss Marple touched Eleanor's sleeve once more. "Shall we go in?" she said. "I find that rooms with fires are generally more conducive to understanding than those without. Warmth has a way of loosening thoughts." They returned to the sitting room. Margaret had arranged herself more comfortably, and Dr. Haydock was in the midst of a story involving a patient who had insisted on diagnosing himself with a rare tropical condition, acquired, it seemed, from reading too many newspapers. And when I suggested that his symptoms were more consistent with indigestion, the doctor was saying, he informed me that I lacked imagination, which may be true, but it has preserved a number of lives. Imagination is overrated, said Mrs. Verney. It leads to novels, and to marriages, said Margaret dryly, which are much the same thing in the first year and quite different thereafter. Julian laughed and took his place beside her. Bellamy remained standing for a moment, then chose a chair slightly apart from the group, where the light fell more strongly on his face. Clara did not return at once. Eleanor found herself watching the door through which she had gone. It remained closed. Miss Marple accepted a second cup of coffee. "Do you know," she said conversationally, "I once knew a woman in St. Mary Mead who arranged her housekeeping accounts so carefully that no one could ever find a discrepancy. It was quite admirable. Only later did it become clear that she had arranged them so carefully because there was one." Julian looked at her with interest. "A discrepancy?" "Yes. A small one, quite easy to overlook if one admired the neatness of the books. But of course, neatness may sometimes be a form of concealment rather than order." Dr. Haydock chuckled. "You make a virtue sound positively suspicious, Miss Marple." "Only when it is practised with unusual consistency," she replied. "Most of us are untidy in some respects. It is part of being human. When a person is tidy everywhere, one begins to wonder what has been put away." Bellamy spoke then, unexpectedly. "You see concealment where others see competence," he said. Miss Marple turned to him with her gentle expression unchanged. "Not always. Only when something draws my attention, and I am afraid I have always been very easily interested." "In trifles?" asked. "In detail," she said. "They are not quite the same." There was a pause, not empty, but filled with the quiet adjustments of thought. Then the study door opened. Clara came back in. She had no papers in her hands now. Her expression was as composed as before, yet there was something altered in her manner, not visible to anyone who was not looking for it perhaps, but to Eleanor it was unmistakable. She had made a decision. Eleanor could not have said what it was, only that it had been made, and that it concerned something already set in motion. Clara crossed the room and resumed her place, taking up her cup as if nothing had intervened. Miss Marple watched her for a moment, then turned her gaze to the fire. "Christmas arrangements," she said lightly, "are always so very careful. One cannot help admiring them, though I have sometimes thought that what is most carefully arranged is not always what is most secure." No one answered. Outside, beyond the orchard and the iron railings, something moved in the dark, or perhaps only the shadow of a branch shifted against the snow. Inside, the house settled around its occupants, each of them carrying something unspoken, each of them arranged, for the moment, exactly where they wished to appear. And in the study, behind the closed door, the service sheets lay where Clara Hastings had placed them, altered, corrected, and very carefully complete. Chapter 5. The Room That Did Not Sleep. Eleanor woke without knowing why. The room was dark except for a faint greyness at the window, where the night pressed thinly against the glass. For a moment she lay still, listening, not to any particular sound, but to the absence of the expected ones. Old houses always spoke in the night, a board easing, a pipe ticking, the soft complaint of settling timber. Nether Witchwood Vicarage had done so earlier, as she drifted towards sleep. Now it seemed to be holding its breath. She turned her head on the pillow. The lavender in the linen had faded to something dry and almost bitter. The warmth from the warming pan was long gone, replaced by a chill that had crept upward from the mattress. Her watch lay on the table beside the bed, its face dimly luminous. 11:30, not late, not early. The hour at which thoughts that have been politely deferred during the day begin to return with less restraint. Eleanor sat up. At once the house resumed its quiet language. A faint shift in the wall, the small settling of the rug beneath her feet as she stood. Nothing out of the ordinary, and yet she remained certain that something had woken her. She crossed to the window and drew the curtain aside a fraction. The orchard lay still, the iron railings cutting the pale ground into strict divisions. The chapel roof rose beyond, darker than the sky. The lamp at the chapel door had been extinguished, leaving the covered passage in shadow. Then, as she watched, a light moved, not in the orchard, in the passage, a small, wavering glow, as of a candle carried by a hand that did not wish to be seen. Eleanor held the curtain aside with 2 fingers and leaned closer to the glass. The figure came into clearer view as it passed one of the narrow windows. A shape, rather than a person, the light cupped low, the movement careful. Clara, even without seeing her face. Eleanor knew it was Clara Hastings. There was a particular steadiness in her gait, a measured economy, as if each step had been considered and approved before being taken. She moved along the passage toward the chapel. Eleanor let the curtain fall. She stood for a moment, undecided. It would be the simplest thing in the world to return to bed, to tell herself that nurses went about at odd hours, that houses required attention even when their inhabitants slept. Yet the thought would not settle. A paper in a hymnal, a second paper read by candlelight, the altered verse. Bellamy's hand tightening. And now this. Eleanor took up her dressing gown and slipped it on. The floor was cold beneath her feet. She did not light a candle. The corridor outside held enough dimness to see by, and she did not wish to announce herself. The door opened with only a small sound. She stepped into the passage and closed it behind her. The house at night was a different place. The angles of furniture altered. Shadows gathered where none had been. The familiar became slightly estranged, as if one had been admitted to a version of the house, not intended for guests. Eleanor moved quietly along the corridor, past closed doors, down the shallow turn of the stair, and into the hall. There was a faint smell of extinguished candles and cooling ash. The fire in the smaller sitting room had burned low, leaving only a dull red glow. Somewhere a clock ticked, slow and deliberate. The door to the covered passage stood ajar. She paused there. The cold reached her at once, sliding along the floor and lifting the edge of her gown. The panes rattled softly, as Mrs. Dallow had described, though now the sound seemed less like movement in the glass, and more like a small persistent tapping from beyond. Eleanor stepped into the passage. The stone flags held the chill more strongly than the wood of the house. Her breath showed faintly as she moved forward. The windows were black now, reflecting only the narrow line of her own pale face as she passed. Ahead, the chapel door stood open. The light within was steady, not the wavering of a carried candle, but the fixed glow of a lamp set in place. Eleanor reached the threshold and stopped. Clara stood at the lectern. The service sheets lay before her, spread rather than stacked. She was not reading them. She was looking at something else. A single sheet placed apart from the rest. The scrap from the hymnal. There could be no doubt of it. Eleanor recognized the size, the fold, the particular whiteness against the darker paper of the printed sheets. Clara held it in both hands. She did not read it, as she had in the passage window earlier. With quick attention, she read it slowly, as if the words required care to be understood, or perhaps as if she already understood them and wished to measure something else. The effect, the consequence, the weight. Eleanor remained where she was unseen. After a moment, Clara folded the paper again, not in the same way. This time the fold was sharper, more exact. She slid it between two of the service sheets and pressed them together with her palm. Then she looked up, not toward the door, toward the organ. It stood closed, the lid down, the bench pushed in. Nothing about it suggested use. Yet Clara regarded it for several seconds, her expression unreadable in the steady light. At last she moved. She gathered the papers into a neat stack, turned and crossed to the small table near the chapel wall where a few stray hymnals had been left. Eleanor drew back slightly, pressing herself into the shadow of the passage. Clara set the papers down, opened one of the hymnals, and slipped the folded sheet inside. Not the same hymnal, a different one, placed carelessly among the others, as if it had been left there without intention. Clara closed the book and set it back. For a moment she stood quite still, her hand resting on the cover. Then she turned and came toward the door. Eleanor stepped back into the passage, her heart beating more quickly than she would have liked. There was no time to retreat entirely. The distance was too short, the movement too evident. Clara appeared in the doorway. For a fraction of a second they faced one another, Clara in the light, Eleanor in the shadow. Then Clara smiled. It was not a startled smile. It was not even an embarrassing one. It was composed, almost as if she had expected to find someone there, and was relieved that it was Eleanor rather than another. "Miss Finch," she said quietly, "I wondered if you might be about. Houses such as this rarely allow their occupants to sleep without interruption." Eleanor stepped forward into the light. "I could not sleep," she said. "I thought I heard something." Clara nodded, as if that explained everything. "I came to check the lamps," she said. "They have a habit of burning unevenly if the wicks are not trimmed. It is a small thing, but small things accumulate." Her gaze moved briefly to Eleanor's face. then back again. There was no sign of alarm, only that same measured composure. "You are cold," she added. "You should not stand here. The passage is unkind at night." "I will go back," Eleanor said. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You have not disturbed me at all." They stood there a moment longer. Eleanor was aware, very precisely, of the position of the hymnals on the table, of the one that now held the folded paper, of the way Clara's body angled slightly between her and the books. "Is everything ready for tomorrow?" Eleanor asked. Clara's expression did not change. "Everything that can be ready," she said. "The rest will depend on what people do. That is always the case." "Yes." There was a faint sound from within the chapel, a shift, a small movement of wood. Clara turned her head slightly, listening. "Did you hear that?" Eleanor said. "It is the building," Clara replied. "Stone settles. Wood responds. One becomes accustomed to it." She stepped past Eleanor into the passage. "Come," she said. "You should not linger. It is not good to imagine things in such places." They walked back together. At the end of the passage, where the warmth of the house began again, Clara paused. "You are observant, Miss Finch," she said. "It was not a question." "I try to be," Eleanor replied. "It is not always a comfort," Clara said. "One sees more than is useful, and yet one cannot stop seeing." "No." Clara's hand rested for a moment on the edge of the door. "If you cannot sleep," she added, "a little hot milk may help. Mrs. Dallow keeps it ready on the hob. I will tell her to leave some for you. That is kind of you." "It is practical," Clara said. "Kindness is often only another word for that." She smiled again, the same composed, untroubled smile, and went down the corridor toward the servants' quarters. Eleanor stood in the hall for a moment, watching her go. Then she turned back toward the sitting room. The fire had burned lower. The embers shifted as she entered, sending up a brief, brighter glow. Shadows moved along the walls, stretching and shrinking as if the room itself were adjusting its shape. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the hearth. She was fully dressed, her hands folded in her lap, her knitting beside her untouched. She looked up as Eleanor entered, as though she had been expecting her. "My dear," she said, "I thought you might come down." Eleanor crossed to her. "You are not asleep either." Miss Marple smiled gently. "At my age, one learns not to insist upon sleep when there are more interesting things to consider." Eleanor hesitated, then spoke. "I saw Miss Hastings," she said. "In the chapel." Yes, she had the paper, the one from the hymnal. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "And she moved it," Eleanor went on. "She placed it in another book." "That is interesting," said Miss Marple. "Very interesting indeed." Eleanor sat down. "Do you know what it is?" she asked. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the fire. "I know that it matters," she said, "and I know that Mr. Bellamy recognized it at once, which suggests that it is not new to him. But Miss Hastings also recognized it," Miss Marple finished softly. "Yes." She leaned forward slightly, her hands still folded. "In St. Memide," she said, "there was once a situation involving a set of recipe cards, very dull on the surface. Lists of ingredients, instructions, the sort of thing one might expect. Only it transpired that the cards had been used some years earlier to pass messages between two people who wished not to be observed. Quite innocent messages at first, then less so." Eleanor listened. "The difficulty," Miss Marple continued, "arose when a third person came into possession of the cards and recognized what they contained. That changed everything. Not because the messages themselves were remarkable, but because they were no longer private." Eleanor felt a small tightening in her chest. "You think the paper is like that?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that it is something written in a place where it was not expected to be found, and that at least two people now understand it, which is always a dangerous number." She looked up at Eleanor, her expression as gentle as ever. "And I think, my dear, that tomorrow's carol service will be very instructive indeed." The fire shifted again, a small collapse of embers, sending up a brief shower of sparks. Eleanor watched them rise and fade. Above, the house remained quiet. In the chapel, beyond the covered passage, the hymnals lay where they had been placed, one of them holding between its pages a folded piece of paper that had already begun to move the lives of those who knew of it. And in the night the vicarage did not sleep. Chapter 6. What the morning chose to show Eleanor came down later than she intended. The light had already found its way into the house, in that thin, deliberate manner peculiar to winter mornings, touching the edges of things rather than filling them. The hall held a pale brightness that seemed to come not from the windows but from the air itself, as though the day had been diluted before being poured in. From the kitchen passage came the steady, reassuring sounds of activity, pans, voices, the occasional clatter that spoke not of disorder but of purpose. The smell of toast drifted outward, accompanied by the sharper scent of coffee and something faintly medicinal which Eleanor associated with Clara's presence more than with any particular substance. She paused at the foot of the stairs. There was a sense, not of excitement but of arrangement. The house felt prepared. Not festive, that would have been too careless a word, but aligned as if each person within it had taken up a position from which they intended to proceed without deviation. Miss Marple sat at the small table in the hall, her knitting in her lap. Though she was not knitting, she appeared to be examining a sprig of holly with quiet attention, as though it had offered itself for consideration. "My dear," she said as Eleanor approached, "you have had a night of thinking, I imagine. It shows in the way you look at things this morning." "Does it?" Eleanor said. "I had hoped it would not. It is not a fault, only a sign that one has begun to notice what others prefer not to." Eleanor sat down opposite her. "Miss Hastings moved the paper," she said. "You were right. It matters." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And the manner in which it matters is beginning to reveal itself, though not yet entirely. Do you think Mr. Bellamy knows it has been moved?" Miss Marple considered the holly for a moment before answering. "I think he suspects something has altered. People who are accustomed to control often sense the smallest deviation. It unsettles them, not because they cannot correct it, but because it suggests that correction may not be enough." Eleanor glanced toward the passage. "And Miss Hastings?" "She has decided upon a course of action," Miss Marple said. "That much is clear. The question is whether she has understood all that her action entails." Eleanor thought of Clara's composed smile, of the careful folding of the paper, of the way she had stood between Eleanor and the hymnals. She seemed very certain. "Certainty," said Miss Marple gently, "is not always a sign of clarity. It may be a sign of necessity." Before Eleanor could reply, the dining-room door opened and Julian emerged, already dressed for the day in a dark suit that had been brushed with more care than usual. "My dear Eleanor," he said, "you have slept well, I hope. We are a little behind ourselves this morning, but only in the way that suggests we shall catch up at precisely the wrong moment." "I slept," Eleanor said. "I am not sure how well. Christmas has that effect. It encourages reflection in those who would rather avoid it." He smiled, but there was strain beneath it. "Arthur is in the chapel," he went on. "He wished to go over the music once more before breakfast. I have told him that no improvement will occur before coffee, but he does not share my view." "And Miss Hastings?" Eleanor asked. Julian hesitated, just slightly. "She is with him," he said. "Arranging the sheets, I believe." Miss Marple rose. "Then we must not delay," she said. "One always learns something by observing people before they have had their first cup of tea. It is the most revealing hour." They went together through the covered passage. The cold was sharper now, the morning air pressing against the glass, with a clearer edge. The panes no longer rattled but held still, as if the night's restlessness had settled into a more deliberate quiet. The chapel door stood open. Inside, Bellamy was already at the organ. The instrument was open, this time, the keys exposed, the stops drawn. He was not playing. His hands rested lightly on the keyboard, as if he were waiting for something to begin. Clara stood beside the lectern. The service sheets lay before her, arranged in precise order. She was not touching them. She was watching Bellamy. Eleanor felt at once that something had shifted. It was not visible in any obvious way. The room was the same, the light, the arrangement, the objects, all unchanged. And yet the relation between the two people at the front of the chapel had altered. There was knowledge there now. Julian stepped forward. "Arthur," he said, "we thought we might join you before breakfast, only briefly. Margaret is resting, and I would not have her find us all vanished." Bellamy turned. "Of course," he said. "We have little time to waste." His voice was controlled as always. Yet Eleanor heard something in it. Not uncertainty, exactly, but a tightening, as if the words were being held more firmly than usual. Clara spoke. "The sheets are ready," she said. "We shall proceed as printed." Bellamy's gaze moved to the papers. "Yes," he said, "as printed." There was a faint emphasis on the last word. Miss Marple had taken a place near the back as before. She sat down quietly, her hands folded, her expression attentive but unremarkable. Eleanor remained standing. Bellamy lifted his hands. "We shall begin with the third verse," he said, "since it appears to be of particular interest." Clara did not move. The organ sounded. The first notes were clear, precise, without hesitation. Bellamy's control had returned. If there had been any disturbance the previous night, it was not visible now in his playing. The verse began. "While shepherds watched their flocks by night." The words rose into the cold air, steadier than before. The absence of the boys made the sound thinner, but also more distinct. Each line stood out more clearly, unsoftened by youthful uncertainty. Eleanor listened. There it was again, that slight irregularity, that pause where there should have been none, that joining of lines that did not quite belong together. Only now, without the distraction of the boys, it was unmistakable. Clara stepped forward. "May I?" she said. Bellamy did not stop playing. "If you must." She reached for one of the sheets. "Here," she said, indicating a line. "The phrasing is altered. It is not as it appears in the book." Bellamy's hands faltered for the briefest moment, then continued. "I am aware of that," he said, "and yet it remains." "Yes." Clara looked at him. "Then it is deliberate." Bellamy stopped. The final note hung in the air for a moment, then faded. "Yes," he said. There was no denial, no evasion, only that single acknowledgement. Julian shifted uneasily. "Arthur," he said, "if there is some difficulty—" "There is no difficulty," Bellamy interrupted. "Only a matter of interpretation." Clara's voice remained even. "And what is your interpretation?" Bellamy turned to face her fully. "That is an error," he said. "An old one. Of no consequence." Clara held his gaze. "I do not think so." Miss Marple spoke then, very softly. "Errors," she said, "have a way of persisting when they serve a purpose. Otherwise they are corrected." Bellamy glanced toward her. "You suggest this serves a purpose." "I suggest nothing," Miss Marple replied. "I merely observe that it has not been corrected." Clara stepped closer to the lectern. "There is more," she said. Her hand moved to the stack of sheets. Eleanor felt a sudden sharp awareness of the moment. The paper, the one Clara had moved in the night. It was here. Clara lifted one of the sheets. "Between these," she said, "there is something that does not belong." Bellamy's face changed. It was not a dramatic change. No sudden shock. No visible alarm. Only a slight tightening around the eyes. A stillness that replaced movement. "I think," Clara continued, "that it should be examined." Julian looked from one to the other. "My dear Clara," he said, "if this is a matter of arrangement—" "It is not," she said. Her voice was quiet, certain. Eleanor felt her breath catch her. Miss Marple did not move. Clara slid the folded paper from between the sheets. For a moment she held it in her hand. Then she placed it on the lectern. "No," Bellamy said. It was the first time Eleanor had heard him speak without control. Clara looked at him. "Yes," she said. There was no anger in it, no triumph, only decision. Bellamy took a step forward. "That is not for you to decide." "It is already decided," Clara replied. The chapel seemed to hold its breath. Julian stepped between them. "Please," he said. "Let us not." But Clara had already unfolded the paper. Eleanor could not see the writing from where she stood. She saw only Clara's face as she read. And in that face, for the first time, there was something that had not been there before. Not composure, not certainty, something else. Something that looked very much like recognition, and something very close to fear. Miss Marple's voice came softly into the stillness. "My dear," she said, "one must be very careful what one chooses to reveal." Clara did not look up. "I have been careful," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I believe you have." Eleanor felt the moment tip. Whatever had been hidden in that paper was no longer entirely concealed. And whatever Clara Hastings had intended by bringing it forward, it had not ended where she expected. Bellamy stood very still. Julian looked from one to the other, his expression uncertain, troubled. The light in the chapel had grown stronger. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. And inside, something that had been arranged with great care was beginning, very quietly, to come apart. Chapter 7. The words that did not belong Clara did not at once read the paper aloud. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. Not the content, not the reaction, but the restraint. Clara held the unfolded sheet in both hands, her eyes moving across it once, then again, more slowly, as though confirming not the words themselves, but what those words now required of her. The chapel seemed smaller. It was not the walls that had shifted, nor the light, nor the objects placed with such care the previous day. It was the space between the people within it. Julian stood slightly forward, uncertain whether to intervene or withdraw. Bellamy remained near the organ, one hand resting on the closed lid, as if anchoring himself to something solid. Miss Marple sat as she had before, composed, attentive, entirely still. Eleanor found that she could hear the faint ticking of the small clock near the vestry door. She had not noticed it before. Now it marked each second with a delicate insistence that made silence feel deliberate rather than empty. "Well," Bellamy said at last. His voice had returned to its usual control, but the effort of it showed. The word was too sharp, too precisely placed. Clara lifted her head. "It is not an error," she said. "No," said Bellamy. "I did not think you would think so." Julian stepped forward. "Arthur, Clara, if this is a matter of some private note—" "It is not private," Clara said. She turned the paper slightly, as if to bring it into clearer light. It was placed in a public book. That alone removes it from privacy. Miss Marple's voice came gently from the back. That is not always the case, she said. Some things are hidden in public, precisely because they are less likely to be noticed there. Clara glanced at her briefly, then back at the paper. This was meant to be noticed, she said. Eleanor felt a small tightening in her chest. Then you had better tell us what it says, Julian said, with a kind of forced lightness that did not quite hold. Clara hesitated. It was not a long hesitation, only enough to suggest that the act of speaking would commit her to something from which there was no easy retreat. Then she read. The words were simple. They were written in a hand that was neat but not practiced, as if the writer had taken care to be legible without possessing the natural ease of one who writes often. Third verse altered, meaning retained. Do not trust the order, he remembers now. Eleanor felt the air shift. It was not a dramatic thing. No one gasped, no one cried out. Yet the words lay in the chapel with a weight that altered everything around them. Julian frowned. I do not understand, he said. What order? What is the meaning? Clara did not answer him. She was looking at Bellamy. He remembers, she said. Bellamy's expression did not change. That, in itself, was a change. I remember a great many things, he said. It is one of the advantages of age. Clara took a step toward him. This is not a general statement, she said. It refers to something specific, something connected to the carol. The Carols is a carol, Bellamy replied. It contains nothing that has not been sung for generations. And yet the third verse has been altered. Yes. And you knew. Yes. And you did not correct it. No. Julian looked from one to the other. Arthur, this is absurd. If there is some irregularity, we can correct it at once. There is no need for. There is every need, Clara said quietly. She lowered the paper. This was written to warn someone, she said, and that someone has now been warned. Miss Marple's hands remained folded in her lap. Or perhaps, she said, to remind someone that a warning had already been given. Clara's gaze flickered toward her again. You see it too, she said. My dear, Miss Marple replied. I see that someone has taken the trouble to place a message where it might be found by a particular person. That is always interesting. It suggests intention rather than accident. Eleanor spoke before she could stop herself. Who wrote it? She asked. Clara looked at her. I did not, she said. The statement was direct, unadorned, and yet it did not entirely settle the question. Julian gave a short, uneasy laugh. Well, if you did not, and Arthur did not, then we must suppose that one of the choir boys has developed a taste for cryptic notes. It was not a boy, Clara said. How do you know? Because a boy would not have written it like this. Bellamy's voice cut across them. This is nonsense, he said. A scrap of paper, a fanciful interpretation, and suddenly we are engaged in some melodrama of warnings and memory. It is Christmas, not a detective story. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. I quite agree, she said. Christmas is rarely improved by melodrama, though it is sometimes illuminated by truth. Bellamy's eyes rested on her for a moment. And you believe this is true? I believe it is a message, she said. Whether it is true depends on what it refers to. Clara folded the paper again. Then we must determine that, she said. Julian spread his hands. How? Clara turned toward the lectern. The carol, she said. The third verse. It has been altered in a particular way. That alteration must mean something. Bellamy shook his head. It means nothing. It is a corruption, introduced years ago, and perpetuated by carelessness. And yet you did not correct it. I have already answered that. Yes, Clara said. You said you chose not to. Bellamy's mouth tightened. I saw no necessity. Clara's voice remained steady. And now? There was a pause. Bellamy did not answer at once. Eleanor watched him. There was something in his face now that had not been there before. Not fear, exactly. Not even reluctance. Something more complex. Something that suggested calculation, not of the immediate situation, but of its implications. At last he spoke. Now, he said, I see that it has been given a significance it does not possess. Miss Marple's eyes moved from him to Clara, then back again. That is one possibility, she said. Another is that it has always possessed that significance. And only now has it been recognised. Julian sighed. This is becoming unnecessarily complicated. Arthur, Clara, if there is some history here. There is no history, Bellamy said sharply. Clara's head lifted. There is always history, she said. It is what gives things their meaning. Bellamy took a step forward. You presume too much, and you deny too much, she replied. The words hung between them. Eleanor felt a sudden, clear understanding. This was not about the carol. The carol was only the place where something else had been hidden. Miss Marple spoke again, her voice as gentle as ever. In St. Mary Mee, she said, there was once a disagreement over a set of church records. Very dull things, full of names and dates, marriages and baptisms. Nothing of interest, one would think. Yet it turned out that a single entry had been altered, very slightly, many years before. The alteration was so small that no one noticed it until someone who had reason to look closely did so. Julian listened, though his expression suggested impatience. "And what happened?" he asked. "The alteration concealed something," Miss Marple said. "Something that had seemed unimportant at the time, but became very important later. When it was discovered, it changed several lives." Clara's hand tightened slightly on the folded paper. "And this is like that," she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "It may be," Bellamy laughed then, but there was no amusement in it. "You build a great deal upon very little," he said. Miss Marple smiled. "One must begin somewhere." Eleanor looked again at the paper in Clara's hand. "He remembers now," she said softly. "Who is he?" No one answered at once. Then Bellamy said, very quietly, "I believe that refers to me." The admission altered the room. Julian stared at him. "Arthur." Clara did not move. "And what do you remember?" she asked. Bellamy met her gaze. "Nothing that concerns you." Clara's expression did not change. "I think it does," she said. Bellamy's voice hardened. "You think a great many things, and you avoid them," she replied. Julian stepped forward again. "This must stop," he said. "Whatever this is, it is not appropriate." "It is necessary," Clara said. Miss Marple rose then. It was not a dramatic movement, only the slow, careful rising of an elderly woman from a chair. Yet it drew attention. "My dear," she said to Clara, "one must be cautious. When a hidden thing is brought into the open, it does not always behave as one expects. It may reveal more than one intended." Clara looked at her. "I am prepared for that," she said. Miss Marple's gaze was kind. "I wonder," she said. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold of the chapel. Something had begun, not the resolution, not even the full understanding, but the beginning of a movement that would not easily be stopped. Bellamy stood very still. Clara held the folded paper. Julian looked from one to the other, caught between them, and Miss Marple, watching them all, seemed to see not only what was present, but what must follow. Outside, the morning had fully taken hold. Inside, the chapel held its quiet, not empty now, but waiting. And in that waiting, Eleanor understood that whatever the paper meant, whatever the altered verse concealed, it had already done its work. Someone remembered, and that memory was no longer safe. Chapter 8. The pattern beneath the words breakfast was taken later than usual, though no one acknowledged the delay. It had the curious quality of meals that follow a disturbance. No one wishes to name. Everything was as it should be, and yet nothing rested comfortably in its place. Margaret presided from her chair, at the head of the table, with determined brightness. She spoke more than she ate, which was not unusual, but the brightness had an edge to it now, as though she were holding the morning together by force of will. "Doctor," Haydock encouraged her gently, steering conversation towards safe ground, the weather in neighbouring villages, the question of holly versus ivy, whether plum pudding improved with age or merely acquired authority. Julian carved toast into precise rectangles and buttered them with unnecessary care. Peter Lorimer, pale and earnest, drank his tea too quickly and burned his tongue, apologizing for it in a manner that suggested he believed it a moral failing. Clara sat opposite Eleanor. She ate very little. Her movements were composed, efficient, without hesitation. Yet Eleanor noticed that she did not once meet Bellamy's eyes, and that when Julian addressed her, she answered him with just enough attention to avoid remark. Bellamy, for his part, behaved as though nothing of consequence had occurred. He discussed the arrangement of the service with Julian, in measured tones, referring to timings, transitions, the placement of candles, the sequence of readings. His voice was steady, his manner controlled, his attention directed entirely outward. Only once did he falter. It was a small thing. Margaret asked whether the choir boys would be given anything warm after the service, as the evening would be cold. Bellamy replied that such considerations were secondary to discipline, then paused just briefly, before adding that arrangements could be made. The pause was no longer than the space between two breaths. Yet Eleanor saw it. Miss Marple saw it too. She sat quietly, stirring her tea long after the sugar had dissolved, her eyes moving from one face to another with the mild interest of a person observing a well-rehearsed play. At last, as the meal drew to a close, she set down her spoon. "My dear Mr. Finch," she said to Julian, "might I trouble you for a copy of the carol? The one we heard this morning. I find myself quite interested in its structure." Julian looked relieved to have something practical to do. "Of course, Miss Marple. There are several copies in the study. I will fetch one at once." "I should prefer," she said gently, To choose one myself, if you do not mind. It is sometimes instructive to see how such things are arranged. Julian hesitated, then smiled. By all means. Clara's hand tightened slightly on her cup, Eleanor noticed. They rose together and moved toward the study. The room held the particular stillness of a place where papers are kept in order, and disturbed only with intention. The desk stood near the window, its surface clear except for a blotter and a neatly arranged set of pens. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that had been read often enough to show it, but not so often as to lose their dignity. On the table near the door lay the stack of service sheets. Clara had placed them there the previous night. They had not been moved. Miss Marple crossed to the table with quiet deliberation. "May I?" she said, though no one had objected. Julian nodded. "Of course." She lifted the top sheet, then another, as though examining them for no more than general interest. Her fingers moved lightly, without hesitation, without searching. Then she stopped. "Ah," she said softly. She drew out the folded paper. Clara did not speak. Eleanor felt the moment sharpen. Miss Marple unfolded the sheet and read it, her expression unchanged. Then she folded it again, not in the manner Clara had used, nor as it had been before, but in a third way, a small, careful alteration that seemed to matter only because she had made it. "My dear," she said to Clara, "you were quite right. This is not an error." Clara's voice was steady. "No." Miss Marple looked at Julian. "You see," she said, "the message refers not only to the altered verse, but to the order in which the words are arranged. Do not trust the order. That is most instructive." Julian frowned. "I do not follow." Miss Marple smiled gently. "That is because you are reading it as one reads a sentence. It was not written to be read in that way." She turned to Eleanor. "My dear, would you be so kind as to fetch a copy of the Carol from the shelf behind you? The one with the blue binding." Eleanor did as she was asked. The book felt cool in her hands, the pages slightly stiff from age. She opened it and found the Carol easily enough. "Now," Miss Marple said, "let us consider the third verse." Eleanor read it silently. It was as she remembered, familiar, and yet not quite. The phrasing shifted. The lines did not align as they should. "Do you see?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "The lines are wrong." "Not wrong," Miss Marple said, altered. She took the book and turned it slightly. "If one reads it as it is printed, it appears merely irregular. But if one reads it differently," she paused, "if one disregards the printed order and follows the sense instead." She traced a finger along the lines, not in sequence, but moving from one to another in a pattern that Eleanor could not immediately follow. Then she spoke the words, "Not the Carol, something else, a sentence." Eleanor felt the breath leave her. It was not a long sentence, not even a complex one, but it was unmistakable. "You promised to forget." The words lay in the room with a clarity that made everything else seem secondary. Julian stared. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "that cannot be." "It is," she replied gently. "The altered verse conceals a second message, a very simple one, quite effective, I think." Clara did not move. Bellamy, who had followed them into the study without Eleanor noticing, spoke from the doorway. "Yes," he said, "quite effective." Eleanor turned. He stood there, his face pale but composed, his eyes fixed on the book in Miss Marple's hands. "You have found it," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "It was not particularly well hidden," she said, "only well placed." Bellamy stepped into the room. "It was never intended to remain hidden," he said, "only unnoticed." Clara's voice came, very quietly. "By whom?" Bellamy did not look at her. "By those who had no reason to notice." "And those who did?" she asked. He met her gaze then. They were expected to understand. Clara's hand tightened at her side. "And you do?" she said. Bellamy's expression did not change. "I do now." Miss Marple folded the paper once more and set it on the table. "My dear Mr. Bellamy," she said, "it is always unfortunate when a promise is remembered by only one of the parties involved. It creates a certain imbalance." Bellamy's lips curved slightly. "Life is full of imbalances, Miss Marple." "Yes," she said, "but some of them are more dangerous than others." Julian looked from one to the other. "I must insist," he said, "that someone explain what this means. We are not playing puzzle. If there is something that concerns this house—" "It does," Clara said. Her voice was no longer entirely steady. "It concerns all of us." Bellamy shook his head. "No," he said, "it concerns the past. And the past, Miss Hastings, is not subject to revision." Clara took a step forward. "It is when it has not been finished," she said. There was silence. Miss Marple's eyes moved between them. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was once a situation involving a letter that had been written and never answered. It remained in a drawer for many years. Quite harmless, one would have thought. Yet when it was finally read, it altered everything, not because it changed the past, but because it revealed that the past had never been what people believed it to be. Julian pressed his hand to his forehead. "This is intolerable," he said. "Arthur, Clara, if there is some history between you—" "There is none," Bellamy said sharply. Clara laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "No," she said. "There is only a promise." Bellamy's eyes hardened. "A foolish one," he said. "Not to me." "To a child," he replied. Clara's face changed. The composure did not vanish. It tightened. "I was not a child," she said. "You were young enough to misunderstand," he said. "And you were old enough to know better," she replied. The words struck. Eleanor felt the truth of them, though she did not yet understand it. Miss Marple spoke softly. "My dears," she said, "it seems to me that the carol has done its work. It has brought something into the open that was not intended to remain there. The question now is what is to be done with it." No one answered. The room held the silence. And in that silence, Eleanor understood that the message, hidden in the familiar, concealed within repetition, had not been meant as a puzzle. It had been meant as a reminder of something promised, something not forgotten, and something that now could no longer be ignored. Chapter 9. What the Garden Knew. It was Miss Marple who suggested the garden, not directly, and not with any urgency. She merely remarked, as they stood in the charged quiet of the study, that a little air often assisted clarity, and that the orchard behind the vicarage had a most instructive arrangement of paths. "It is curious," she said mildly, "how one sees things differently when one is not enclosed by walls. Even very agreeable walls, you understand." Julian seized upon the suggestion at once, with the relief of a man offered a practical alternative to an emotional impasse. Yes, quite right. We are all too close together here. A turn in the garden will do us good. Arthur, Clara, perhaps we might continue this conversation outside, where it may be conducted with rather less constraint. Bellamy hesitated only a fraction before inclining his head. "As you wish." Clara said nothing, but she followed. They went out by the side door, through the small stone porch, where boots and umbrellas gathered, and into the orchard. The air had a thin brightness to it now. The frost had not entirely lifted, and the ground still held that delicate, brittle quality which gives way underfoot with a soft, decisive sound. The iron railings cast long, narrow shadows across the grass, dividing it into strips of light and dark, like the bars of some careful arrangement. Eleanor drew her coat closer about her as they walked. Miss Marple moved beside her, her steps small but steady, her eyes taking in the orchard with quiet interest. "There is always something to be learned from a garden," she said. "Even in winter, one sees what remains when everything else has been stripped away." Eleanor glanced at the espalier pear trees, their branches trained flat against the walls, their shapes precise even in bareness. "They look almost unnatural," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "They have been persuaded into a form that suits their keeper. It is very neat. And yet one sometimes wonders what they would have been had they been left to themselves." Ahead of them, Julian had stopped near the far end of the orchard, where a narrow path turned back toward the house. Bellamy stood a little apart, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the railings as if they presented a problem to be solved. Clara stood facing him. The distance between them was not great, yet it seemed significant, a space not easily crossed. Julian cleared his throat. "Now," he said, "let us proceed with some degree of reason. We have before us a message, concealed, it appears, within a carol, which refers to a promise. Arthur, Clara believes this concerns you. You have acknowledged as much. It would be greatly to everyone's advantage if the nature of that promise were made clear." Bellamy did not turn. "There is nothing to be gained by revisiting old misunderstandings," he said. Clara's voice came, steady and low. "It is not a misunderstanding. It is precisely that." "No," she said. "It is a memory." Bellamy's shoulders stiffened. "Memory is unreliable." "Not when it has been carried for years," Clara replied. "Not when it has shaped everything that followed." Julian looked between them, his expression troubled. "Clara," he said, "if there is something you believe—" "I do not believe it," she interrupted. "I know it." Bellamy turned then sharply. "And what is it you think you know?" he demanded. Clara held his gaze. "That you promised," she said, "and that you did not keep that promise." The words fell into the cold air with a clarity that seemed to sharpen everything around them. Bellamy's expression did not alter at once. Then, slowly, a faint, almost incredulous smile touched his mouth. "My dear Miss Hastings," he said, "you speak as if promises were contracts, as if they possessed the force of law." "They possess the force of consequence," she replied. Miss Marple, standing slightly to one side, gave a small nod, as though acknowledging the accuracy of the statement. In St. Mary Mead, she said gently, there was once a gentleman who promised to marry a young woman after a certain event had taken place. The event occurred. The marriage did not. He considered the matter closed. She did not. It led to a great deal of quiet unhappiness which was only discovered much later, when it could no longer be remedied. Julian shifted uneasily. This is hardly the same. It is exactly the same, Clara said. Her voice had changed now. Not raised, not uncontrolled, but carrying something beneath it. A pressure long contained. Bellamy's eyes hardened. You made a mistake in your position, he said. Whatever you imagine occurred, it has no bearing on the present. It has every bearing, she said. It explains everything. Everything, he repeated. Yes. There was a pause. Eleanor felt it, not empty, but filled with something gathering. Bellamy spoke again, more quietly. You were a child, he said. You did not understand the circumstances. Clara's face did not change, but something in her eyes did. I understood enough, she said. I understood that you asked something of me, and that you gave your word in return. Bellamy shook his head. You are constructing a narrative to suit your own recollection. No, she said. I am recalling what happened. Julian stepped forward. Arthur, he said. If there is any truth in this, there is not, Bellamy said sharply. Clara laughed again, that same short, controlled sound. You forget, she said, but you forget selectively. Bellamy's gaze flickered. Do I? Yes. She took a step closer. You forget the letter, she said. You forget what you asked me to do with it. You forget what you said would happen if I did. Bellamy's expression changed then. It was a small change, a tightening, a stillness. Eleanor saw it. Miss Marple saw it too. My dear, Miss Marple said softly, letters have a way of persisting, even when one believes them to have been disposed of. It is one of their most inconvenient qualities. Clara's hand moved, almost unconsciously, to the pocket of her coat. I did as you asked, she said. I kept it. I did not show it. I did not speak of it. For years. Bellamy's voice was low. And now, she said, you remember. He looked at her. And what do you intend to do with that? Clara did not answer at once. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the orchard, over the railings toward the house. Eleanor followed her glad. The vicarage stood quiet, its windows reflecting the pale morning light. It looked unchanged, as it had the previous day, as it had perhaps for years, and yet everything within it had shifted. Clara spoke. I intended, she said slowly, to ensure that you did not forget again. Bellamy's mouth tightened. And you believe this? Display will achieve that. I believe it has already begun to. Julian ran a hand through his hair. This is madness, he said. A letter, a promise. We are speaking in fragments. If there is something that concerns this house, this parish, it does, Clara said. Her voice was calm again, composed. It concerns the truth. Bellamy gave a short, dismissive gesture. The truth, he said, is that you have allowed a childish memory to grow into something it was never intended to be. Clara's eyes did not leave him. No, she said. The truth is that you have allowed a promise to become something you hoped would be forgotten. There was silence. Miss Marple spoke into it, very gently. One finds, in my experience, that the things we hope will be forgotten are precisely those that remain most clearly in the minds of others. It is a curious injustice. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. She looked at Clara. You have the letter? She asked. Clara did not turn. Yes, she said. Bellamy's gaze sharpened. You kept it. Yes. For all these years. Yes. And now you bring it forward. Clara shook her head slightly. No, she said. I brought forward the reminder. She touched the pocket again. The letter has always been there. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her with quiet interest. And what does the letter say? She asked. Clara's expression did not change. It says what he promised, she said. Bellamy's voice was very quiet. And you intend to show it? Clara looked at him. I have not yet decided. Eleanor felt the weight of that. Not yet decided. The phrase held more than hesitation. It held possibility. Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. That is wise, she said. One must be very careful what one chooses to reveal. Once revealed, it cannot be returned to its former state. Clara's gaze moved briefly to her. I know, she said. Bellamy took a step closer. Then consider carefully, he said. Because once this is done, there will be consequences. Clara met his eyes. There have already been consequences, she said. The orchard held the silence. The frost underfoot, the railings, the bare branches, all seemed to witness the exchange without comment. Eleanor felt with sudden clarity that they stood at a point from which there was no easy return. The message had been found, the pattern beneath the words had been seen, and now the truth, whatever it was, waited, not in the past where it had been hidden, but in the present where it demanded to be acknowledged. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the house. "Shall we go in?" she said gently. "The morning advances, and there is still much to be done before evening." No one moved at once. Then Julian nodded, as if accepting a necessity he could not alter. "Yes," he said. "Yes, we must." They turned back toward the vicarage. Clara walked ahead. Bellamy followed, a pace behind. Eleanor lingered for a moment, looking at the orchard, at the paths, the railings, the careful arrangement of things shaped over time. Miss Marple came to stand beside her. "It is always interesting," she said softly, "how much a place remembers, even when the people within it prefer not to." Eleanor nodded. "Yes," she said, "and how little it forgets." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear," she said, "places do not forget at all. It is only people who attempt it, and they are rarely successful for long." They went in, and behind them the orchard remained quiet, ordered, and entirely indifferent to the secrets it had witnessed. Chapter 10. What was not said at luncheon? Luncheon was quieter than breakfast. Not outwardly there were voices, dishes, the ordinary movements of a household maintaining its rhythm, but quieter in the sense that certain subjects had been set aside without agreement, and everyone knew it. Margaret noticed it first. "You are all behaving as if you had been lectured," she said, looking around the table with a kind of brisk irritation. "I do not know who has done it, but I would like to thank them for the improvement." "It is most unusual." Julian smiled too quickly. "My dear, we are merely conserving our energies for the evening. Arthur has us all in training." "Arthur has always had you in training," Margaret replied. "It is the rest of us I find surprising." She turned to Clara. "You are very quiet today, Clara. Have you exhausted your supply of sensible remarks? Or are you reserving them for the service?" "I have nothing of importance to add at present," she said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That would be a first." Dr. Haydock intervened smoothly. "I have found in my experience," he said, "that silence is often a sign of good judgment, particularly when the alternative is explanation." Margaret gave a short laugh. "You are all conspiring to be dull," she said. "Very well, I shall compensate." She launched into an account of a parish woman who had insisted upon decorating her pew with artificial snow, which had then refused to remain in place, creating what Margaret described as a theological blizzard of entirely the wrong sort. The story was amusing. It should have drawn laughter. It did, in a way. But Eleanor noticed that Bellamy did not join in. He ate with care, his movements precise, his attention directed entirely toward his plate. Only once did he look up, and then it was toward Clara. She did not meet his gaze. Miss Marple, seated near the end of the table, observed all this with the mild interest she had shown throughout the day. She asked Margaret a question about the arrangement of the altar flowers, then listened to the answer with a small, attentive nod. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "we once had difficulty with altar flowers at Christmas. A lady insisted upon white lilies, which are very beautiful, of course, but have a way of dominating everything else. Another preferred holly, which is less imposing but more traditional. The result was a compromise that satisfied no one and produced a most curious effect. The lilies looked apologetic, and the holy appeared resentful." Margaret laughed properly at that. "And what did you do?" she asked. "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple said. "One rarely improves such situations by intervention. It is generally more instructive to observe how they resolve themselves." Julian glanced at her, then at Clara and Bellamy. "Yes," he said quietly, "quite." After luncheon the house was divided. Margaret retired to rest, though she declared it unnecessary. Dr. Haydock accompanied her with the air of a man who intended to remain within earshot of her breathing. Peter Lorimer went to the vestry to arrange the candles, a task he approached with the seriousness of one aware that wax has a will of its own. Julian remained in the study, ostensibly to review the order of service, though Eleanor suspected that he was attempting to impose structure on something that resisted it. Clara disappeared for a time. Bellamy went to the music room. Eleanor found Miss Marple there. The room held the faint, dry warmth of the previous day, the scent of polish and paper unchanged. The piano stood as it had before, its surface cleared, the hymnals arranged in a neat stack. Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting in her lap once more, though again she was not knitting. "You see," she said as Eleanor entered, "how everything has been put back in its place." Eleanor looked at the piano. "Yes," she said, as if nothing had happened. "Just so," Miss Marple replied. "That is often the first instinct, to restore the appearance of order." Eleanor crossed to the piano and touched one of the hymnals. "The paper is not here," she said. "No," said Miss Marple. "It has moved on." Eleanor turned. "Where?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, it is no longer the paper that matters. It has done its work. What matters now is what people do in response to it. Eleanor sat down. You understand it, don't you, she said. The message, the letter, the promise. Miss Marple folded her hands. I understand enough, she said, though not perhaps everything. One must be careful not to assume too much too soon. Eleanor hesitated. He promised her something, she said, years ago, something connected to a letter. Yes, and he did not keep that promise. That appears to be the case. And now she has reminded him. Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed, Eleanor leaned forward. But why now, she asked. Why hide the message in the carol? Why not simply speak to him? Miss Marple's eyes moved to the window, where the orchard lay pale and still. In St. Mary Mead, she said, there was once a situation involving a gentleman who had borrowed a sum of money and neglected to return it. The lady to whom it was owed did not confront him directly. Instead, she arranged for a small notice to appear in the parish magazine, referring to the matter in terms only he would understand. It was very effective. Eleanor frowned. Why? Because it placed the matter in a context he could not control, Miss Marple said. He could not deny it without drawing attention to it. He could not ignore it without appearing guilty. He was obliged to act, though he did not wish to. Eleanor considered this. So Clara has done the same. Yes, Miss Marple said. She has created a situation in which Mr. Bellamy must respond. The message, the altered verse, the paper, all these are means to that end. Eleanor looked at the piano again. And the letter? Miss Marple's expression grew more thoughtful. That is the heart of it, she said. The thing that gives the rest its meaning. Eleanor felt a small chill. She has kept it all these years. Yes, and now she may show it, perhaps. There was a pause. Eleanor spoke again. Do you think she will? Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she picked up her knitting and examined it as though considering whether to resume. At times, she said at last, people keep such things, not because they wish to use them, but because they cannot bear to let them go. The letter, in this case, may represent something more than its contents. It may represent a moment, a choice, a loss. Eleanor thought of Clara in the chapel, of the way her composure had shifted when she read the paper. She seemed afraid, she said. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Yes, that is interesting. Why? Because fear suggests uncertainty, Miss Marple said. And uncertainty suggests that the outcome may not be what she intends. Eleanor frowned. You think she may not understand what she is doing. I think, Miss Marple said gently, that she understands part of it very well. But there may be another part, a part she has not yet considered. Eleanor sat back. And Mr. Bellamy? Miss Marple's gaze returned to the window. He remembers, she said. That is the important thing. The message has done that much. And now, Miss Marple said, he must decide what to do with that memory. Eleanor felt the weight of that, a decision, one that could not be avoided. From the passage came the sound of footsteps. Bellamy entered the room. He paused when he saw them, then crossed to the piano. I trust I am not disturbing you, he said. Not at all, Miss Marple replied. We were merely admiring the arrangement of your hymnals. Bellamy glanced at them. They are in order, he said. Yes, Miss Marple said. Very much so. There was a faint emphasis in her tone. Bellamy did not respond. He opened the piano and sat down. For a moment he did not play. Then, slowly he began. The melody was familiar, the same carol, the same altered verse. Eleanor listened. The irregularity was still there. But now, knowing what lay beneath it, she heard it differently. Not as an error, not even as a concealment, but as something deliberate. A pattern, a message. Bellamy played through the verse, then stopped. He did not turn. You have discovered it, he said. Miss Marple's voice gentle. Yes, and you understand it. To a degree. There was a pause. Bellamy's hands rested on the keys. It was not meant to be found, he said. Miss Marple smiled slightly. My dear Mr. Bellamy, she said. It was meant to be found by someone. He did not answer. Eleanor watched him. There was something in his posture now, not the rigid control of the previous day, but something more complex, something like strain. You remember, Miss Marple said softly. Bellamy's hands tightened slightly. Yes, and you did not expect to. No. There was another pause. Eleanor felt the room hold it. What will you do? Miss Marple asked. Bellamy did not answer at once. Then he said, very quietly, what I should have done years ago. The words settled into the room. Eleanor felt their weight. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. That would be the sensible course. Bellamy closed the piano. I will speak to her, he said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him. I think, she said gently, that you must. He rose. For a moment he stood there, as if considering something further. Then he turned and left the room. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. It is always a mistake, she said softly, To leave a matter unfinished. It has a way of completing itself in the most inconvenient manner. Eleanor looked at her. And this one? Miss Mar's needles moved at last. This one, she said, is very near its conclusion. Outside, the light had shifted again. The day was moving toward evening, and with it, the moment when what had been hidden would no longer remain so. Chapter 11. What he remembered too late. The light had begun to fade by the time Eleanor saw them again. It came early, as winter light always did, withdrawing not all at once but in small careful degrees, as though reluctant to abandon what it had revealed. The orchard beyond the windows had lost its brightness and settled into a pale, indistinct grey. The iron railings no longer cast shadows. They simply marked divisions that could no longer be seen. Inside the vicarage, candles had been lit. They stood in small steady clusters on mantels, on side tables, in the hall, their flames upright and composed, as if they had no intention of wavering. The house had taken on that particular evening aspect which belongs to Christmas preparations, ordered, expectant, and just slightly removed from ordinary time. Eleanor stood in the corridor outside the study. The door was not fully closed. Voices came from within. She had not meant to listen. That was the first thing she told herself. Yet she did not move away. Bellamy's was speaking. It was a mistake, he was saying. A youthful one. It should never have been made. Clara's voice answered, low and steady. And yet it was. Yes, and you asked me to keep it. There was a pause. Yes, and you promised. I know what I promised, Bellamy said sharply. The sharpness did not last. It softened at once, as if he had recognized it and wished to withdraw it. I remember, he said more quietly. That is the point, is it not? I remember now. Eleanor leaned slightly closer to the door. Clara did not speak immediately. When? She asked at last. Bellamy's voice carried a strain Eleanor had not heard before. Recently, he said. Very recently, when I saw the alteration again, the verse. It returned, Clara repeated. Yes. And before that, I had not thought of it in years. Clara gave a small, almost inaudible laugh. No, she said. You did not. There was no bitterness in it. That somehow made it worse. I told you, Bellamy said. It was a mistake. It should not have been allowed to persist. And yet you allowed it. I did not remember it. You chose not to remember it, she said. That is not the same thing. It is exactly the same thing, Clara replied. There was silence. Eleanor could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the study mantel. It seemed louder here in the enclosed space, as though time itself had drawn nearer to listen. What do you want? Bellamy asked. The question was abrupt, direct. Clara answered without hesitation. The truth, she said. You have it. No, she said. I have your memory. That is not the same thing. Bellamy moved. Eleanor heard the faint scrape of a chair. What more do you require? He said. Clara's voice remained steady. I require you to say it, she said. Not as an explanation, not as a justification, as a fact. Bellamy did not answer at once. Eleanor felt the weight of that silence. Then he spoke. I wrote the letter, he said. Clara did not respond. I wrote it, he repeated. I asked you to keep it. I told you that if you did, certain consequences would be avoided. What consequences? Clara asked. Bellamy hesitated. It is not necessary to revisit that. It is, she said. If you are to tell the truth, you must tell all of it. There was a long pause. Then Bellamy said, very quietly, I told you that if the letter were made known, it would damage someone who had done nothing to deserve it. Clara's voice softened slightly. And you believe that? Yes. And now? Bellamy's answer came more slowly. Now, he said, I am less certain. Eleanor felt something shift. Clara spoke again. And the promise, she said. Bellamy drew a breath. I told you, he said, that if you kept the letter I would ensure that the matter concerned would never trouble you again. And did you? There was no answer. Did you? Clara repeated. Bellamy's voice was very quiet. No. Clara stood, Eleanor imagined, very still. No, she said. You did not. I could not, he said. You chose not to. I did not understand. You understood enough to ask me, she said. You understood enough to promise. Bellamy's voice rose slightly. I was trying to prevent harm, and you caused it instead. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Eleanor felt that there was silence. Then Clara spoke again. You said, she said, that if I kept the letter, everything would be as it had been, that nothing would change. Yes. And that was not true. No. There was a pause. Clara's voice, when it came again, was different. Not steady now. Not entirely. Do you know what happened? She said. Bellamy did not answer. Do you know, she went on, what became of the thing you were trying to protect? No, he said. There was a slight break in the word. No, he repeated. Clara's breath caught. Then you do not remember enough, she said. Eleanor felt her own breath tighten. What do you mean? Bellamy asked. Clara's voice was very quiet. I mean, she said, That your promise did not fail in the way you think it did. Bellamy moved again. Explain yourself. Clara did not answer at once. Then she said, the letter concerned someone else. Yes. And you believed that by keeping it hidden, you would protect them. Yes. And you believed that nothing would change. Yes. There was a pause. Clara's voice, when it came again, was almost gentle. It changed, she said. Bellamy did not speak. It changed, she repeated. And you did not see it. You did not look. Eleanor heard the faint sound of paper. Clara must have taken the letter from her pocket. I kept it, she said, as you asked. I said nothing. I showed no one. Yes. And because of that, it remained hidden. Yes. And because it remained hidden, what it contained was never corrected. Bellamy's voice was strained. What was there to correct? Clara did not answer immediately. Then she said, everything. There was a long silence. Eleanor felt the moment stretch. What are you saying? Bellamy asked. Clara's voice was very quiet. I am saying, she said, that the harm you were trying to prevent was not prevented. Bellamy drew a breath. Then what was the point? The point, Clara said, was that you asked me to carry it. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. That was it. Not the letter itself. Not even the promise. The carrying of it. Miss Marple's voice came into Eleanor's mind. Soft and certain. Some things are kept not because one wishes to use them, but because one cannot bear to let them go. Inside the study, Bellamy spoke again. I did not know, he said. No, Clara replied. You did not, and now you tell me. Yes, there was a pause. What do you intend to do? He asked. Clara's answer came slowly. I do not know, she said. Eleanor felt the truth of that. Not a decision now. Not yet. Only the recognition that something must be done. The study door opened. Eleanor stepped back at once, moving silently down the corridor, before either of them could see her. She did not go far, only far enough to stand in the shadow near the turn of the stair, where she could breathe again. A moment later, Bellamy came out. He did not see her. He walked past, his face set, his eyes fixed ahead, as if he had already chosen a direction and would not deviate from it. Clara followed more slowly. She paused in the doorway, looking back into the study for a moment, then closed the door behind her. Her expression was composed, but Eleanor saw it. The strain, the uncertainty, the weight of what had been carried and what might now be released. Clara turned and went toward the chapel. Eleanor remained where she was. The house seemed to hold its breath again. The evening was approaching. The service will begin soon. And whatever had been remembered, whatever had been promised, was no longer confined to the past. It had entered the present, and it would not leave quietly. Chapter 12, The Truth That Sang Itself. The chapel filled slowly. Not with urgency, nor with excitement, but with that steady, habitual movement which belongs to villages and rituals repeated over many years. People came in twos and threes, stamping the cold from their feet, lowering their voices without being told, glancing toward the front with that mixture of expectation and familiarity which attends any well-known service. The lamps had been lit earlier than usual. Their glow settled warmly against the stone, softening the severity of the walls and giving the place a gentler aspect than it had possessed that morning. The pews filled, coats were folded, programs were adjusted. Eleanor took her place near the back, beside Miss Marple. From there she could see everything. Julian stood near the lectern, speaking quietly with Peter Lorimer, whose expression suggested a man who had been given responsibility and feared it might prove equal to him. The choir boys gathered at the side, their earlier restlessness subdued into a kind of solemn anticipation. Clara stood near the front. She held the service sheets in her hands. Her posture was composed. Her expression is calm. Only the slight tension in her shoulders suggested anything beneath it. Bellamy was at the organ. He sat as he had that morning, upright, precise, his hands resting lightly on the keys. From this distance he appeared entirely as he always had, controlled, exact, untroubled. Only Eleanor, watching closely, saw the difference. It was in the stillness. Not the natural stillness of composure, but something more deliberate, as if stillness itself were being maintained against movement. Miss Marple leaned slightly toward her. It is a very curious thing, she murmured, how the most important moments often occur in the most ordinary settings. One might almost say they prefer it. Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the front. The service began. Julian's voice carried clearly as he spoke the opening words. There was nothing in them to suggest that anything was amiss. The congregation responded as it always did. The familiar patterns unfolded, reading, prayer, response, all as expected. And yet beneath it, Eleanor felt the tension, not visible, not acknowledged, but present, like a note held just below the level of hearing. At last, the carol. Julian announced it with quiet formality, while shepherds watched their flocks by night. There was a small rustle as the congregation lifted their books. Clara moved forward slightly, distributing the sheets to those who needed them. Bellamy's hands rose. The organ began. The first verse passed without incident. The second followed, and then the third. Eleanor felt it before she heard it. That shift. That slight, deliberate irregularity. The alteration. It moved through the music like a thread, barely visible, yet unmistakable once recognized. The congregation sang on, unaware. But at the front, something changed. Clara stepped forward, not abruptly, not dramatically, simply a movement that placed her slightly closer to the lectern. Her voice joined the singing, clear, steady, distinct. And then she stopped. Not entirely, not in a way that broke the flow, but enough to draw attention. Julian glanced toward her. Bellamy's hands faltered. Only for a fraction, but it was enough. The organ shifted. The pattern broke. The verse did not end as it should have. There was a moment. A small one, but in that moment the structure of the familiar gave way, and something else emerged. Clara spoke, not loudly, but clearly. Do not trust the order, the words carried, not as part of the carol, but alongside it. The congregation faltered, voices dropped. Some stopped entirely. Bellamy's hands still. The organ fell silent. The chapel held the echo. Julian stepped forward. Clara, he began, but she did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on Bellamy. You remember, she said. It was not a question. Bellamy rose, slowly, deliberately. He turned to face the congregation, and for the first time, Eleanor saw him without the protection of his role. No longer the director, no longer the authority, only a man. I do, he said. His voice carried, not as strongly as before, but clearly enough. There was a murmur. Julian looked bewildered. Arthur, he said, what is this? Bellamy did not answer him. He looked at Clara. I wrote it, he said. The words fell into the chapel, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. I wrote the letter, he continued. I asked her to keep it. I promised. He stopped, just for a moment, then he went on. I promised that nothing would change. The silence deepened. Clara did not move. And I was wrong, Bellamy said. He did not raise his voice. He did not seek to justify. He simply spoke. I did not understand, he said. I believed I was preventing harm. I believed that by concealing it, I was preserving something. He drew a breath. I was not. Miss Marple's voice came softly from the back. No, she said. You were not. Bellamy did not look toward her. He kept his gaze on Clara. I forgot, he said, or chose to. It is difficult to distinguish between the two. But I remember now. Clara's hands tightened on the sheets. And now, she said. Bellamy hesitated, only briefly. Then, I will not conceal it again, he said, the words settled. The congregation shifted, not understanding, but sensing. Julian stepped forward again. Arthur, if there is something that must be said, it should not be said like this. It must, Bellamy said. There was no force in it, only certainty. Clara spoke. The letter, she said. Bellamy inclined his head. Yes. She did not move. Then say it, she said. Bellamy's gaze did not waver. I wrote a letter, he said. It contained something that should have been corrected, something that affected. Another, I asked Clara to keep it. I told her that if she did, it would remain as it was. He paused. It did not. The words were simple, but their meaning extended beyond. Clara's voice was quiet. And now, Bellamy's answer came without hesitation. Now, he said, it must be put right. Eleanor felt the shift. Not resolution, not yet, but movement. The truth once spoken had begun its work. Miss Marple rose, not quickly, not with any attempt to draw attention, but she rose. My dear, she said, her voice gentle, it is always better to complete what has been left unfinished, even if one does so rather later than one might wish. Bellamy inclined his head slightly. Yes, he said. Clara stood very still. The tension in her shoulders eased. Not entirely, but enough. Julian looked from one to the other, still uncertain. The congregation murmured. Confusion, curiosity, concern, but beneath it understanding, beginning. The carol remained unfinished. The third verse, altered and revealed, had done what it was meant to do. It had brought the truth into the open, and once there, it could not be returned. Miss Marple turned slightly, her gaze moving across the chapel. Shall we continue? She said. Julian blinked. Yes, he said. Yes, of course. The service resumed, not as it had begun, but as it must. And Eleanor, standing at the back, understood that the truth had not been forced into the light. It had sung itself there, quietly, inevitably, and now it would be heard. Chapter 13. What remained? Music. The chapel emptied more slowly than it had filled. People did not leave in the usual quiet pairs, exchanging small remarks about the cold, or the candles, or the length of the service. They lingered. They spoke in lowered voices, not because the setting demanded it, but because something in the air required it. Julian stood near the door, shaking hands with each person as they passed, his expression composed by effort rather than ease. Peter Lorimer hovered beside him, offering brief, earnest words that seemed to ask forgiveness for something he did not understand. Margaret had been brought in for the latter part of the service, and now sat near the front, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes moving from one face to another, with a sharpness that illness had not diminished. Clara remained where she was. The service sheets lay on the lectern, untouched. Her hands rested lightly at her sides. The composure she had maintained throughout the day had not left her, but it had changed. It was no longer a barrier. It was something quieter, something that allowed for what came next. Bellamy stood near the organ. He had not resumed his place at the instrument after speaking. He had not withdrawn either. He remained where he had stepped forward, as if accepting that there was no longer any advantage in retreat. Miss Marple and Eleanor approached slowly. "It is always a little difficult," Miss Marple murmured. "When a truth has been spoken in a place intended for other things, people are not quite sure whether to treat it as part of the occasion or as something separate from it." Eleanor nodded. "They do not know what to do with it." "No," Miss Marple said. "And so they do what people generally do in such circumstances. They wait." They reached the front. Julian came toward them at once. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "I hardly know what to say. This interruption." "It was not an interruption," Miss Marple said gently. "It was a continuation, only something that began some time ago." Julian pressed his hand to his forehead. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I suppose it was." He looked toward Bellamy and Clara. "They will have to explain," he said. "To me, to Margaret, to the parish, if necessary." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Perhaps," she said, "though explanations are not always as useful as one might hope. It is often actions that matter more." Julian sighed. "I begin to see that." He moved away again, drawn back to his duties. Eleanor turned to Clara. "You have done what you intended," she said. Clara looked at her. "Yes," she said, "I have." There was no triumph in it, only acknowledgement. "And now?" Eleanor asked. Clara's gaze shifted briefly to Bellamy. "Now," she said, "it is no longer mine alone." Miss Marple nodded. "That is generally the case," she said. "Once something has been brought into the open, it belongs to everyone who has heard it. One cannot easily reclaim it." Bellamy approached them. His face had altered, not in any dramatic way. The lines were the same, the expression was still controlled, but something had been removed, or perhaps something had been revealed. He stopped a short distance from Clara. "I have spoken to Julian," he said. "He understands what is necessary." Clara's eyes did not leave him. "And Margaret?" she asked. "I will speak to her," he said. "She deserves to hear it from me." Clara inclined her head slightly. "Yes," she said. There was a pause. Bellamy's voice softened. "The letter," he said. Clara reached into her pocket. For a moment she held it there, her hand still. Then she drew it out. It was as Eleanor had imagined. A single sheet, worn at the folds, the paper softened by time and handling. It did not look remarkable. It did not announce its importance. Clara looked at it. Then she held it out. Bellamy did not take it at once. "You have kept it," he said. "Yes, for all these years." "Yes, and now you give it back." Clara met his gaze. "I'll give it to you," she said. "What you do with it is no longer my responsibility." Bellamy hesitated. Then he took it. His fingers closed around the paper with a care that suggested he understood at last its way. "I will read it," he said. "You have already read it," she said. "That is why we are here." Bellamy's expression shifted. "Yes," he said. "That is true." Miss Marple spoke softly. "It is not the reading that matters now," she said. "It is what follows from it." Bellamy looked at her. "And what do you suppose that should be?" he asked. Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Mr. Bellamy, I should not presume to advise you, but I have observed that when a promise has been broken, the only satisfactory course is to acknowledge it fully, and to do what one can to repair the consequences, even if that repair comes rather late." Bellamy inclined his head. "Yes," he said. "I see that." Clara stepped back slightly. "I have no wish to see it," she said, "only to know that it has been done." Bellamy looked at her. "And will that be enough?" he asked. Clara considered. Then she said, "It will be sufficient." There was quiet in that. Not a complete resolution, but something close to it. Julian returned Margaret beside him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright. "Arthur," she said, "you have something to tell me." Bellamy turned to her. "Yes," he said. He did not hesitate. He did not look away. "Then tell me," she said. He did, not loudly, not for the room, but clearly enough. Eleanor did not hear every word. She did not need to. She saw Margaret's face as he spoke, the change in it, the understanding, the disappointment, and, beneath it, something else, something quieter. When he finished, Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she said, You should have told me before. Yes, he said. I see, she said. There was no further reproach. Only that. Julian stood beside her, his hand on her arm. Clara watched. Miss Marple watched. Eleanor watched. And in that watching, she understood something she had not fully grasped before. The crime, if it could be called that, had not been the letter, nor even the promise. It had been the silence that followed, the decision to leave something unfinished, to allow it to remain unresolved. Miss Marple spoke very softly. In St. Mary Mead, she said, there was once a gentleman who believed that by not speaking of a difficulty, he had avoided it. It took many years for him to understand that he had merely allowed it to grow. Eleanor nodded. Yes, she said. That is what happened here. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear, she said, it is what happens in most places. Only the details differ. The chapel had nearly emptied now. The candles burned lower. The air held the faint scent of wax and winter. Clara moved toward the door. She paused, then turned back. Thank you, she said. It was not addressed to anyone in particular, and yet it was understood. Bellamy inclined his head. Miss Marple returned the gesture. Eleanor said nothing. Clara went out into the cold. Bellamy remained. Julian and Margaret stood together. Miss Marple and Eleanor followed more slowly. Outside, the night had settled. The orchard lay still, the railings dark against the pale ground. The house waited. As it always did, Miss Marple paused at the threshold. It is a sad thing, she said quietly, to see how much trouble can come from a single promise made without sufficient thought. Eleanor looked at her. And yet, she said, it has been put right. Miss Marple considered this. Partly, she said, which is often the best one can hope for. They stepped out into the night. And, behind them, in the chapel, the music had ended. But what it had revealed remained.